On December 14, 1933, the Ritz-Carlton Ballroom in New York held 1,000 guests for Barbara Hutton's 21st birthday. The room had been transformed into a winter forest. White birch trees imported from upstate, silver leaves hung by hand, orchestras rotating every 2 hours. Barbara wore white satin and her grandmother's emeralds. Photographers were barred from entering, but they lined the street outside, waiting for her to leave. The party cost $60,000. Outside, men stood in bread lines that stretched for blocks. Newspapers printed the expense on their front pages beside photographs of soup kitchens. Columnists did not need to editorialize. They simply printed the numbers and let readers draw their own conclusions. Barbara had not chosen the date, the venue, or the guest list. Her attorneys and financial advisors had organized everything, citing the importance of her public debut as an heiress to the Woolworth fortune. She smiled in the photographs that later appeared despite the ban. In private letters written years afterward, she mentioned the party only once, describing it as the night she learned what it meant to be looked at but not seen. The evening made her the most famous young woman in America. She would spend the next 50 years attempting to purchase what that night had cost her. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born on November 14, 1912, in the Fifth Avenue mansion her grandfather had built from the profits of 5 and dime stores. The nursery had been decorated in pale blue silk, the cradle gilded and carved by European craftsmen. Her birth was announced in newspapers across the country, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented: the continuation of a fortune built on selling cheap goods to working families. Her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, had never wanted the life she married into. She was Frank Woolworth's middle daughter, raised in luxury, but taught that displays of wealth were vulgar, that excess invited resentment. When she became pregnant with Barbara, she was already unwell. The pregnancy worsened her condition. Doctors prescribed bed rest, then tonics, then stronger medications whose names were never recorded in family letters. Barbara was 3 weeks old when her mother first tried to hurt herself. The attempt was quiet, managed by household staff before Frank Woolworth could be informed. Edna was moved to a different floor of the mansion. A wet nurse was hired. Barbara's father, Franklin Hutton, spent increasing amounts of time at his brokerage office in Lower Manhattan, returning to the house only for dinner and not always then. By the time Barbara was 4, she had learned not to ask where her mother was. Edna had been moved again, this time to a suite of rooms where she was attended by nurses around the clock. Barbara was told her mother was resting, that she needed quiet, that children were too loud for someone in her condition. On rare occasions, Barbara was brought to the doorway of her mother's rooms and allowed to look inside. Edna would be in bed or sitting by the window, her face turned away. She did not speak to Barbara during these visits. A nurse would place a hand on Barbara's shoulder after a few minutes and guide her back down the hall. Barbara's grandfather visited her every evening before dinner. Frank Woolworth was 70 years old, his empire built and his energy failing, but he maintained the ritual of checking on his granddaughter with the same punctuality he had once applied to inspecting store inventories. He would sit in the nursery's upholstered chair and ask Barbara about her day. She learned quickly that he preferred certain kinds of answers: mentions of lessons completed, books read, polite behavior with the governess. He did not ask about her mother, and Barbara understood, in the way children understand unspoken rules, that she should not mention her either. On May 2, 1917, Edna Woolworth Hutton was found dead in her bedroom. The official cause was suffocation, attributed to an ear infection that had spread. The private physician who signed the death certificate had been treating her for years and said nothing publicly about the medication she had been taking or the previous attempts. The funeral was held at the mansion. Barbara, 5 years old, wore black and stood beside her father during the service. Her grandfather did not attend. He sent a note saying his health would not permit it. After the funeral, Barbara's father left for Europe. He told the household staff he was conducting business that could not be postponed. He would return, he said, within a few months. The months extended into a year. Letters arrived occasionally, always brief, always addressed to Frank Woolworth rather than to Barbara. Her father sent instructions about her education, her diet, her schedule. He did not ask how she was. Barbara remained in the mansion with her grandfather and the servants. Her routine expanded to fill the emptiness. Lessons with her governess lasted most of the day: French, deportment, piano, penmanship. She ate lunch alone in the nursery. Dinner was sometimes taken with her grandfather in the main dining room, at a table built to seat 20. The servants stood along the walls during these meals, waiting to refill glasses or replace plates. They did not speak unless addressed. Barbara learned to eat without making noise, to sit without fidgeting, to answer her grandfather's questions about her studies with precision. The governess was replaced when Barbara was 7. The new woman was younger, more cheerful, instructed to take Barbara on supervised walks through Central Park. During these outings, other children would sometimes approach, drawn by Barbara's expensive clothes or her elaborate perambulator. The governess would step between them, explaining politely that Miss Hutton was not able to play at the moment, that they needed to return home. Barbara did not protest. She had learned by then that other children existed in a different world, one she could observe but not enter. Her grandfather began taking her to his office when she was 8. The Woolworth building was the tallest in the world, its lobby finished in marble and gold leaf. Frank Woolworth would bring Barbara to the executive floor and seat her in a chair outside his office while he worked. She was given books to read, puzzles to solve. Employees passing in the hallway would nod to her, their expressions carefully neutral. No one stopped to speak. At the end of the day, her grandfather would emerge and take her hand, leading her to the private elevator that descended directly to his waiting car. On these trips, he sometimes talked about the business. He told her how he had started with a single store, how he had learned that people wanted small luxuries they could afford, how he had built an empire by understanding what they desired, even when they themselves did not. He spoke about expansion, about competition, about the importance of watching costs. Barbara listened without fully understanding, absorbing the cadence of his voice more than the content of his words. When Frank Woolworth died in 1919, Barbara was 6 years old. She was in the nursery when it happened, working on a watercolor her governess had set up by the window. A maid came to the door and whispered to the governess, who set down her own book and told Barbara to continue painting. An hour later, her father arrived at the mansion, the first time she had seen him in more than a year. He did not embrace her. He told her that her grandfather had passed, that the funeral would be in 3 days, that she would be expected to attend. The will was read a week later in the presence of attorneys. Barbara was too young to attend, but the terms reached her through overheard conversations between servants, through the sudden change in how people addressed her, through the way her father's visits became more frequent and his tone more solicitous. She had inherited a portion of her grandfather's estate, held in trust until her 21st birthday. The amount was not disclosed to her, but the household staff began treating her with a deference that felt different from before. Less familiar, more cautious. Her father moved back into the mansion. He occupied a suite on the 3rd floor and took his meals in his private sitting room. Barbara saw him at breakfast on Sundays and occasionally in the evening when he summoned her to discuss her education. He hired new tutors, stricter and more numerous. Her schedule filled with additional languages, mathematics, art history, literature. The lessons left little time for anything else. She began to understand during these years that the money separating her from the rest of the world was not something she had earned or chosen. It had simply appeared, the way her mother's absence had appeared, the way her father's distance had appeared. She learned that wealth did not bring people closer. It made them careful. The servants smiled and obeyed, but never lingered. Her tutors arrived punctually and departed the moment their contracted hours ended. Her father spoke to her with the same polite formality he used when addressing his attorneys. Barbara was 10 when her father remarried. The wedding took place in California, far from New York, and the Woolworth mansion. Barbara was not invited. She learned about it from a notice in the newspaper, which the governess tried to hide, but which Barbara found folded inside a discarded magazine. Her father's new wife was younger than him, from a family with money, but less of it. They honeymooned in Europe for 6 months. When they returned, Barbara's father informed her that she would be sent to boarding school. He had selected an institution in Connecticut with an excellent reputation, small class sizes, students from appropriate families. She would begin in the fall. Until then, she would remain at the mansion with the governess and the household staff. Her father and his new wife took a separate residence in Manhattan, a townhouse near Gramercy Park. Barbara was given the address but never invited to visit. The boarding school was called Brookwood Hall, set on 200 acres in the Connecticut countryside. Barbara arrived in September 1922, driven from New York in her father's Rolls-Royce. The headmistress met them at the entrance, a woman named Mrs. Carruthers who spoke in clipped sentences and shook hands without smiling. Barbara's father stayed for 20 minutes, touring the dormitory where Barbara would sleep and the classroom where she would study. He signed the enrollment papers in the headmistress's office and left without saying goodbye. Barbara shared a room with 3 other girls, daughters of railroad executives and manufacturing families. Their trunks were smaller than hers. On the first night, they asked her questions: where she was from, whether she had brothers or sisters, what her father did. Barbara answered carefully, omitting details she had learned not to mention. When one girl asked if she was related to the Woolworth stores, Barbara said yes, but offered nothing further. The conversation ended. The girls turned away and spoke to each other in lower voices. The school's curriculum emphasized discipline and routine. Classes began at 8 and continued until 4, broken only by lunch in the dining hall. Barbara studied Latin, French literature, European history, advanced mathematics. The teachers were competent but distant, correcting her work with red ink and moving on to the next student. She earned high marks in every subject. No one praised her for it. On weekends, parents visited. Cars arrived on Saturday mornings, families taking their daughters into town for lunch or walks through the campus grounds. Barbara's father came once during her first semester, staying for an hour. He asked about her studies, inspected her dormitory, and left a check with the headmistress to cover incidental expenses. He did not return for the rest of the term. Barbara spent those weekends in the library, reading books she selected from shelves organized by century and subject. She preferred biographies, accounts of lives already completed, their outcomes known and unchangeable. She read about queens who had died in exile, artists who had worked in obscurity, explorers who had vanished in uncharted territories. The librarian, an elderly woman named Miss Parsons, noticed her sitting alone each Saturday and began recommending titles. She never asked why Barbara was there instead of with her family. During the Christmas holiday, Barbara returned to the Fifth Avenue mansion. Her father and his wife were traveling in Palm Beach and would not be back until after New Year's. The household staff prepared meals for her, maintained the house, and otherwise left her alone. She spent 2 weeks moving through rooms that felt larger and emptier than she remembered. On Christmas morning, gifts appeared beneath a tree in the drawing room: a set of leather-bound books, a pearl necklace, a fur-lined coat. Each had a card from her father, signed in handwriting she did not recognize. She returned to Brookwood in January. The other girls talked about their holidays: ski trips to Switzerland, parties in Boston, relatives visiting from abroad. Barbara listened and said nothing. One girl, the daughter of a steel magnate, asked where she had gone. Barbara said she had stayed in New York. The girl asked if she had done anything interesting. Barbara said no. The pattern held for 3 years. Barbara excelled academically, remained isolated socially, spent holidays alone or with servants. Her father visited twice more during this period, each time staying less than an hour. His wife never came. Letters arrived occasionally, written by a secretary and signed by her father, inquiring about her health and her studies in identical phrasing each time. In the spring of 1925, Barbara received word that her father had arranged for her to continue her education in Europe. She would attend a finishing school in Paris, an institution that catered to the daughters of American industrialists and European aristocracy. She was 13 years old. The headmistress at Brookwood informed her during a private meeting in her office, handing her a letter from her father that outlined the arrangements. Barbara would leave in June, immediately after the term ended. A chaperone had been hired to accompany her on the crossing. The ship was the SS Aquitania, departing from New York Harbor on a warm afternoon. Barbara stood at the railing as the city receded, watching the buildings shrink into silhouettes. The chaperone, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Danforth, stayed below deck, claiming seasickness. Barbara remained on deck for hours, alone except for crew members moving past without acknowledging her. The finishing school in Paris occupied a former manor house near the Bois de Boulogne. The curriculum focused less on academics and more on social accomplishment. Conversational French, classical music, ballroom dancing, the proper management of household staff. Barbara's classmates were older, some already 16 or 17, preparing for debuts and marriages. They spoke about men they had met, parties they planned to attend, the importance of being seen at the right places by the right people. Barbara absorbed the lessons with the same diligence she had applied at Brookwood, but the material felt different, less like education, and more like instruction in a performance she would eventually be required to give. The teachers corrected her posture, her pronunciation, the way she held a teacup. They taught her how to enter a room, how to accept a compliment, how to deflect an inappropriate question without giving offense. She learned that grace was a form of labor, that elegance required constant attention. Her father visited once during her 2 years in Paris. He took her to lunch at a restaurant near the Place Vendôme, a place where waiters wore white gloves and menus had no prices. He ordered for both of them without asking what she wanted. During the meal, he told her about his business interests, about investments in South American railroads and German manufacturing. He spoke about the economy, about opportunity, about the importance of preserving capital. Barbara ate her food and listened. When he asked if she was happy in Paris, she said yes. He seemed satisfied with the answer. The school encouraged friendships among students, organizing teas and group excursions to museums and theaters. Barbara attended these events but found herself standing at the edges of conversations, present but not included. The other girls had histories with each other, families who knew each other, summers spent at adjacent estates. They referenced people and places Barbara had never heard of, laughing at jokes whose context she did not share. She learned to smile at appropriate moments and excuse herself early. One girl, the daughter of a French duke, made an effort to include her. Her name was Celeste, and she spoke English with a slight accent. She invited Barbara to sit with her during lectures, to walk with her in the gardens after classes. They had tea together twice. Celeste asked questions about New York, about Barbara's family, about what she planned to do after finishing school. Barbara answered in generalities, revealing little. Celeste stopped inviting her after that. In the evenings, Barbara wrote letters. She wrote to her father, brief notes describing her progress in her studies, mentioning nothing personal. She wrote to the household staff at the Fifth Avenue mansion, asking how they were, whether the house was being maintained, if they needed anything. She wrote to Miss Parsons, the librarian at Brookwood, thanking her for the book recommendations and asking for more. Most of these letters went unanswered. Her father's secretary replied on his behalf, confirming receipt. The mansion's butler wrote back once, a formal note assuring her that all was well. Miss Parsons never responded. Barbara graduated from the finishing school in the spring of 1927. She was 15. Her father sent instructions that she would return to New York and reside at the Fifth Avenue mansion while he arranged the next phase of her education. He did not attend the graduation ceremony. Barbara crossed the Atlantic alone this time, no chaperone required. She spent the voyage in her cabin reading novels and watching the ocean through the porthole. Back in New York, the mansion felt smaller than it had when she left. The staff greeted her politely, carried her luggage to her old rooms, and resumed their routines. Her father visited 2 days after her arrival. He told her he had hired a new governess, someone to supervise her continued education at home until she was old enough for a proper debut. The governess would arrive the following week. The woman's name was Miss Adelaide Preston, a former instructor at one of the Seven Sisters colleges. She was 43, unmarried, severe in manner, and precise in speech. She arrived with a curriculum she had designed herself, covering philosophy, political economy, classical literature, and art history. Barbara's days returned to the structure she had known as a child. Lessons from morning until late afternoon, meals taken alone, evenings spent reading in the library. Miss Preston did not engage in conversation beyond the academic. She corrected Barbara's essays with marginal notes, but offered no commentary on their content. She assigned books and expected written analyses by the following session. She taught with competence but without warmth, treating education as transaction rather than exchange. During this period, Barbara began accompanying her father to social events, dinners at the homes of other wealthy families, charity galas, opera performances. She was introduced as his daughter, smiled appropriately, and spoke when addressed. The conversations at these events followed predictable patterns. Women asked about her education, her interests, her plans. Men spoke to her father and ignored her entirely unless she was standing directly beside him. She noticed how people looked at her. Their eyes would move from her face to her jewelry, to her dress, to her father standing nearby. She could see them calculating, assessing, determining what she represented. No one asked what she thought about anything that mattered. They asked where she had traveled, what she had studied, whether she enjoyed Paris. She learned to answer these questions in ways that satisfied without revealing. At one dinner, seated beside the wife of a banking executive, Barbara was asked if she felt fortunate. The woman smiled as she said it, her tone light, the question seemingly innocent. Barbara understood what was being asked, whether she recognized her privilege, whether she was grateful, whether she understood how others lived. She said yes, she felt very fortunate. The woman nodded and changed the subject. Barbara turned 17 in November 1929. The stock market had collapsed 6 weeks earlier. Her father's wealth, invested in stocks and securities, had diminished but not vanished. Other families they knew had been ruined. Suicides were reported in the newspapers. Men who had owned banks and factories now stood in lines outside employment offices. Her father spoke about it once during dinner, mentioning that caution would be necessary, that expenses would need to be monitored. The household staff was not reduced. No changes were made to Barbara's education or allowance. Barbara's debut was scheduled for December 1930, delayed a year due to what her father called inappropriate timing. The stock market crash had made extravagant celebrations look callous, but by late 1930, the families who still had money had resumed their social calendars. Weddings were announced, charity balls organized, debutante seasons planned. Her father hired a social secretary to manage the arrangements. The woman's name was Mrs. Vivian Hartley, a widow who had made a profession of guiding young heiresses through their social launches. She arrived at the mansion in October with 3 leather-bound notebooks containing lists of potential venues, caterers, florists, and acceptable guests. She sat across from Barbara in the drawing room and explained that a debut was not a party, but an investment in reputation, in social position, in future marriage prospects. Mrs. Hartley asked Barbara what kind of event she envisioned. Barbara said she had not thought about it. Mrs. Hartley's expression tightened slightly. She explained that the debut would be the most important night of Barbara's life, the moment when she transitioned from girl to woman in the eyes of society. Everything needed to be perfect. Barbara agreed to whatever Mrs. Hartley recommended. The planning consumed 3 months. Mrs. Hartley visited the mansion twice a week, presenting options and requiring decisions. Barbara chose between floral arrangements she could not distinguish, between orchestras whose music she would not hear over the crowd, between menu items she would be too anxious to eat. Her father attended none of these meetings. He signed checks and approved expenses, but left the details to Mrs. Hartley. The guest list became a source of tension. Mrs. Hartley compiled names from society registers, cross-referencing families by wealth, title, and social standing. She eliminated anyone whose reputation had been compromised, whose finances had failed, whose lineage could not be verified. The final list contained 1,000 names. Barbara recognized fewer than 50. Her father reviewed the list and added names of business associates, men whose goodwill he needed or whose connections served his interests. These additions were not debutantes or young people Barbara might befriend, but middle-aged industrialists and their wives, people who would attend out of obligation rather than celebration. Mrs. Hartley objected, explaining that the demographic balance would be disrupted. Barbara's father told her the names would remain. The newspapers began writing about the debut in November. The first article appeared in the society pages of the New York Times, a brief notice announcing that Barbara Woolworth Hutton would be introduced to society in December. The article mentioned her inheritance, estimating the trust fund at $50 million. The figure was speculative, but not inaccurate. Other newspapers reprinted the story, adding details about the Woolworth fortune, about her mother's death, about her years in European schools. By early December, the coverage had shifted in tone. Columnists began questioning the appropriateness of a lavish debut during an economic depression. They printed the estimated cost of the party, $60,000, besides statistics about unemployment and homelessness. Editorial cartoons appeared showing Barbara in a tiara while families stood in bread lines. One headline called her, "The $1 Million Baby in the Five and Dime." Mrs. Hartley advised canceling. She came to the mansion with the newspapers folded under her arm and told Barbara's father that proceeding would be a public relations disaster. He dismissed her concerns. The invitations had been sent, the vendors hired, the arrangements made. Canceling would suggest weakness, an acknowledgement that public opinion mattered more than family tradition. The debut would proceed as planned. Barbara read the articles in her room at night, sitting by the window with the newspapers spread across her lap. She read descriptions of herself written by people who had never met her, judgments rendered by strangers who knew only the size of her inheritance. One columnist wrote that she had never worked a day in her life, that she had been raised in obscene luxury while children starved, that her debut was an insult to every American struggling to survive. Another suggested that the Woolworth fortune had been built on the backs of poorly paid workers, that Barbara's wealth was morally tainted, that she should be ashamed. She mentioned the articles to her father once during one of their brief Sunday breakfasts. She asked if they should consider a smaller event, something private. He set down his newspaper and told her that people would always resent wealth, that their opinions were irrelevant, that she needed to learn to ignore criticism from those who did not matter. He returned to his reading. The conversation ended. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom was transformed over 2 days. White birch trees were brought in from upstate New York, their branches wrapped in silver leaf. The ceiling was covered in fabric to create the illusion of a winter sky. 4 separate orchestras were hired, rotating every 2 hours to ensure continuous music. Tables were set with baccarat crystal and Belgian linen. The menu included oysters, pheasant, and champagne imported from France. Barbara's dress was made by a designer in Paris, shipped to New York in a custom trunk. The fabric was white satin, the bodice embroidered with seed pearls. Her grandmother's emerald necklace was brought from the vault, along with matching earrings and a bracelet. A hairdresser arrived at the mansion at noon on the day of the debut, spending 3 hours arranging Barbara's hair in the style Mrs. Hartley had specified. Photographers lined the street outside the Ritz-Carlton, despite the ban Mrs. Hartley had negotiated with hotel management. They shouted Barbara's name as she stepped from the car, flashbulbs igniting in rapid succession. Her father walked beside her, his hand on her elbow, guiding her through the crowd. She kept her eyes forward and her expression neutral, the way she had been taught. Inside, the ballroom was already filled. Guests stood in clusters, holding champagne glasses and speaking in voices that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Barbara was announced at the entrance. Conversations paused. People turned to look. Applause began, polite and measured, spreading through the room like a wave. She descended the staircase alone, her father having stepped aside. She reached the bottom and stopped, unsure where to go. Mrs. Hartley appeared at her side and guided her toward a receiving line that had formed near the orchestra. Barbara shook hands for 2 hours. Guests offered congratulations, complimented her dress, wished her well, their faces blurred together. She smiled and thanked them, repeated the same phrases until the words lost meaning. Some guests lingered, attempting conversation, asking about her plans or her interests. She answered briefly, aware of the line extending behind them. Others moved past quickly, fulfilling an obligation and returning to their drinks. The young men at the party had been selected by Mrs. Hartley from appropriate families. Heirs to banking fortunes, sons of European nobility, graduates of Ivy League universities. They were introduced to Barbara in a sequence throughout the evening, each escorting her to the dance floor for a single waltz before being replaced by the next. They asked formulaic questions and seemed relieved when the dance ended. One told her she looked beautiful. Another asked if she was enjoying herself. A third said nothing at all, counting steps under his breath. She ate nothing during the dinner service. The plates were placed before her and removed untouched. She drank half a glass of champagne and felt it go to her head immediately. The room grew warmer as the night progressed, the air thick with perfume and cigar smoke. She excused herself at one point and went to the powder room, locking herself in a stall and sitting on the closed toilet lid for 10 minutes. When she emerged, Mrs. Hartley was waiting outside asking if she was unwell. Barbara said she was fine. The party ended at 2 in the morning. The orchestras played their final songs. Guests collected their coats and departed, their voices fading as they moved into the hotel lobby. Barbara stood near the door with her father, thanking people as they left. Some paused to compliment the event. Others walked past without acknowledgement. When the last guest had gone, her father told her she had done well. He left immediately afterward, saying he had an early meeting. Barbara remained in the ballroom alone. The staff had begun cleaning, collecting empty glasses and folded napkins. The birch trees would be dismantled in the morning, returned to wherever they had come from. She stood in the center of the room, beneath the fabric sky, listening to the sound of chairs being stacked and tables being cleared. The newspapers the next morning were worse than before. The front page of the Daily Mirror showed a photograph of Barbara in her emerald necklace beside an image of a soup kitchen. The headline read, "The Poor Little Rich Girl." Other papers ran similar stories, contrasting the cost of the party with the suffering of ordinary Americans. Editorials condemned her father for permitting such excess. Letters to the editor called Barbara selfish, spoiled, out of touch. One writer suggested she should be taxed at a higher rate as punishment for her indifference. Barbara stopped reading after the third newspaper. She asked the household staff to remove all papers from the house and cancel the subscriptions. Her father called later that day and told her to ignore the coverage, that it would fade within a week. He was wrong. The stories continued for months. Reporters began calling her the poor little rich girl in every article, the phrase becoming inseparable from her name. She received letters at the mansion, delivered by the dozens each day. Some were marriage proposals from men she had never met, offering companionship in exchange for financial security. Others were requests for money, from strangers claiming medical emergencies, from distant relatives seeking loans, from charities asking for donations. A few were threats, anonymous notes calling her a parasite, warning that her wealth would not protect her forever. Mrs. Hartley stopped visiting. Her work was complete. The debut had achieved its purpose, introducing Barbara to society, even if society had responded with hostility rather than acceptance. Her father resumed his travel schedule, spending weeks at a time away from New York. Barbara remained in the mansion, her social calendar empty, her debut having accomplished nothing except making her more visible and more alone. In the spring of 1933, Barbara's father informed her that they would be spending the summer in Europe. He had business in London and Paris, meetings that could not be postponed. She would accompany him along with his wife and a small household staff. They would sail in June and return in September. The crossing was smooth, the weather mild. Barbara spent most of the voyage in her cabin, reading and writing letters that she never mailed. Her father and his wife took meals in the first-class dining room, where they entertained business associates and made social connections. Barbara joined them twice, sitting at the far end of the table while her father discussed tariffs and currency exchange rates with men who barely acknowledged her presence. They arrived in London during the social season. Her father rented a townhouse in Mayfair, a 4-story building with a staff of 8. Barbara was given rooms on the 3rd floor, overlooking a private garden she was not permitted to use. It belonged to the adjacent property. Her father attended meetings during the day and dinners in the evening. His wife went shopping and visited friends from her previous trips to Europe. Barbara remained in the townhouse with nothing expected of her. A week after their arrival, her father's wife suggested Barbara attend a garden party, being held by an American expatriate family. It would be good for her to meet people her own age, to be seen in appropriate social settings. Barbara agreed without enthusiasm. A car was arranged. She wore a pale yellow dress and a hat she disliked. The party was held at a rented estate outside London, the grounds filled with white tents and women in pastel gowns. Barbara knew no one. She stood near the refreshment table, drinking tea and watching groups of guests who seemed to know each other intimately. After an hour, a young man approached her. He introduced himself as Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow. He was Danish, he said, though his family had estates in several countries. He asked if she was enjoying the party. Barbara said it was pleasant. He asked if she was visiting London or living there. She explained that her father was conducting business, that they would return to New York in the fall. He asked her name. When she told him, his expression changed slightly. Recognition, followed by a carefully controlled smile. He had read about her, he said. The newspapers had covered her debut. She did not respond. He changed the subject, asking instead about her impressions of London, whether she had been to the theater, if she enjoyed traveling. They spoke for 20 minutes. He was polite, attentive, and visibly interested. When the conversation paused, he asked if he might call on her. Barbara hesitated, then gave him the address of the Mayfair townhouse. He kissed her hand and walked away. She watched him rejoin a group of young men near the lawn, saw them glance in her direction, and resumed talking. Count von Haugwitz Reventlow called 3 days later. The butler informed Barbara that a gentleman was waiting in the drawing room. She found him standing by the window, examining a painting on the wall. He turned when she entered and smiled. He had brought flowers, white roses arranged in paper. He asked if she would join him for tea. They went to a hotel near Hyde Park, a place where waiters moved silently between tables and conversations were conducted in low voices. He asked about her childhood, her education, her family. She answered vaguely, offering no details that might reveal too much. He spoke about his own background, his family's titles, their estates in Denmark and Germany, the decline of European aristocracy after the war. He mentioned financial difficulties with a tone of regret, but no shame, explaining that old families often struggled to maintain their properties in the modern economy. Barbara listened and said little. She noticed how he watched her, how his attention never wavered, how he seemed genuinely interested in her responses. It was different from the interactions she had experienced before, where people looked past her or spoke to the money instead of the person. He asked if he might see her again. She said yes. Over the following weeks, Count von Haugwitz-Reventlow called on her regularly. They took walks through Kensington Gardens, attended concerts, had dinner at restaurants where he always insisted on paying despite her offering. He spoke French and German fluently, quoted poetry, discussed art and music with knowledge that seemed genuine. He told her about his childhood in Copenhagen, about summers spent at his family's country estate, about his education at European universities. He also spoke about his family's financial struggles with increasing frequency. The estate in Denmark required constant repairs. Death taxes had consumed much of the family wealth. His mother was elderly and needed care they could barely afford. He never asked Barbara for money directly, but the implications were clear. She did not offer, and he did not press. In August, he proposed. They were sitting in the garden of a country house where they had been invited for the weekend by mutual acquaintances Barbara had never met before. He took her hand and told her he had fallen in love with her, that he wanted to marry her, that he believed they could be happy together. He said nothing about her money. Barbara looked at his face, at the sincerity in his expression, and wanted to believe him. She told him she needed time to consider. He said he understood, that he would wait for her answer. That evening she wrote to her father, who was in Paris on business. She explained that Count von Haugwitz-Reventlow had proposed, that she was considering accepting, that she wanted his advice. Her father's reply arrived 3 days later. The letter was brief. He had made inquiries about the Count's background. The family was legitimate but financially ruined. The Count had no income and considerable debts. Her father advised against the marriage but acknowledged that the decision was hers to make. He reminded her that any financial arrangements would need to be carefully managed by her attorneys. Barbara accepted the proposal a week later. The Count was delighted. They announced the engagement to the small circle of expatriates who formed their social world in London. Congratulations arrived along with thinly veiled observations about the fortunate timing of the match. Barbara's father returned from Paris and met with the Count privately. The conversation lasted 30 minutes. Afterward, her father told Barbara that a prenuptial agreement would be required, drafted by his attorneys, protecting her inheritance from any claim. The Count agreed to the terms without objection. The wedding was held in Paris on May 14, 1933. Barbara was 20 years old. The ceremony took place at the Russian Orthodox Church, a requirement of the Count's family despite neither of them being Orthodox. 40 guests attended, mostly European aristocrats and American expatriates. Barbara's father gave her away. His wife did not attend, claiming illness. Barbara wore ivory silk and a veil that had belonged to the Count's grandmother. She carried white orchids. The service was conducted in a language she did not understand, the priest's voice echoing through the incense-filled church. She repeated vows phonetically, guided by the Count's whispered translations. When the ceremony concluded, they walked down the aisle to polite applause. Outside, photographers from European newspapers captured their exit. The next day, headlines announced that the American heiress had married a European count. Some articles mentioned the size of her fortune. Others speculated about the Count's motives. They honeymooned in Venice, staying at a palazzo rented by the week. The Count was charming and attentive during the day, escorting her through museums and along canals. At night, Barbara lay awake in the unfamiliar bedroom, listening to sounds from the canal below and wondering if she had made a mistake. The Count slept soundly beside her, his breathing even and undisturbed. When they returned to Paris, the Count's financial requests began. He needed funds to settle debts, to repair the family estate, to maintain appearances appropriate to his title. Barbara's attorneys had anticipated this, establishing an allowance for household expenses and personal costs. The Count spent it within weeks. When Barbara asked what the money had been used for, he explained that certain obligations could not be avoided, that his family name carried responsibilities, that she could not understand the pressures of maintaining aristocratic standing. Barbara increased the allowance. The Count spent that too. She spoke to her father's attorneys, who advised establishing stricter controls. The Count became angry when informed of the new restrictions. He accused Barbara of treating him like a servant, of humiliating him, of breaking the promises she had made. She relented and removed the controls. By the end of their first year of marriage, the Count had spent over $1 million. Barbara's attorneys documented the expenditures: gambling debts in Monte Carlo, loans to friends who never repaid them, a yacht purchased and sold at a loss, gifts to women whose names appeared in hotel registries. When confronted, the Count denied nothing. He explained that this was how men of his class lived, that Barbara's American middle-class values did not apply to European aristocracy, that she had known who he was when she married him. Barbara asked for a separation in December 1934. The Count refused. Under the terms of their prenuptial agreement, a divorce initiated by either party would leave him with nothing. He had no income, no assets, and no prospects. Remaining married to Barbara was his only source of financial security. He told her they could live separately if she preferred, but he would not grant her a divorce. They moved into separate residences. Barbara took an apartment in Paris. The Count remained in London, living on the allowance her attorneys continued to provide. He called occasionally, always with a request, a medical expense, a family emergency, a business opportunity that required immediate capital. Barbara usually agreed. Refusing felt petty, and the money meant nothing to her. In early 1935, Barbara discovered she was pregnant. She had not seen the Count in 3 months. The pregnancy was confirmed by a French physician who asked no questions about her marital situation. She informed the Count by letter. He arrived in Paris 2 days later, insisting they reconcile, that a child required a stable household, that he would change his behavior. Barbara did not believe him but agreed to try. They rented a house in the countryside outside Paris, a place the Count selected and Barbara paid for. He stayed for 6 weeks before returning to London, claiming business that could not be managed remotely. Barbara remained in the house with a doctor and 2 nurses the attorneys had hired. The pregnancy was difficult. She was sick constantly, lost weight, spent weeks in bed under doctor's orders. The child, a son, was born on February 24, 1936. They named him Lance. The Count arrived 3 days after the birth, stayed long enough to hold the baby and pose for photographs, and left the following morning. He sent a telegram a week later requesting additional funds for nursery expenses. Barbara's attorneys paid the invoice. Barbara filed for divorce in Reno, Nevada in September 1937. The city had become a destination for wealthy women, seeking quick dissolutions, requiring only 6 weeks of residency to establish jurisdiction. Barbara rented a house on the outskirts of town and waited. The Count contested nothing. His attorneys negotiated a settlement, $2 million paid immediately in exchange for relinquishing all claims to Barbara's future income and assets. He signed the papers without traveling to Nevada. The divorce was finalized on November 2, 1937. Barbara was 25 years old and had been married for 4 years. Lance, not yet 2, remained with her. The Count was granted visitation rights, but exercised them rarely. He remarried within a year, choosing another American heiress whose fortune was smaller, but whose family was less protective. That marriage lasted 18 months. Barbara returned to New York after the divorce. The Fifth Avenue mansion had been closed for years, the furniture covered in sheets, the staff reduced to a skeleton crew that maintained the property, but did not live there. She stayed instead at the St. Regis Hotel, occupying a suite on the 18th floor. Lance had a nursery adjacent to her rooms, staffed by 3 nurses who rotated shifts to ensure constant supervision. Barbara saw him in the mornings before his breakfast and in the evenings before his bedtime. The rest of the day belonged to the nurses. She began appearing at social events again, attending charity galas and dinner parties hosted by families who had known her father. The conversations were stilted. People congratulated her on the divorce, then changed the subject quickly. She noticed how women watched her, their expressions calculating, assessing whether she would become competition for their unmarried brothers or eligible sons. Men spoke to her with exaggerated politeness, their interest transparent. Everyone knew how much she was worth. In early 1938, she met Count Kurt Haugwitz Reventlow at a party in Manhattan, no relation to her ex-husband, despite the similar title. He was younger than the first Count, more attractive, less obviously desperate. He worked in the film industry, producing pictures for a small studio that made historical dramas on modest budgets. He spoke about art and literature, seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, and did not mention money during their first 3 conversations. By their 4th meeting, he had asked her to invest in his next film. The budget was small, he explained, only $200,000. The studio was underfunded, the project at risk of cancellation. With her backing, they could complete production and release something meaningful. Barbara said she would consider it. He smiled and thanked her, then changed the subject as though the request had been casual rather than calculated. She invested the money. The film was completed but never widely released. It screened at a single theater in Los Angeles for 2 weeks before being pulled due to poor attendance. Count Kurt Haugwitz Reventlow apologized, explaining that distribution had been mishandled, that the marketing budget had been insufficient, that the audience for intelligent cinema was unfortunately limited. He asked if she might consider funding his next project. Barbara declined. He stopped calling. Barbara heard later that he had found another investor, a widow from Chicago, and that his new film had achieved even less success than the first. In June 1938, Barbara sailed to Europe. Lance remained in New York with his nurses. She told friends she needed time away, that the divorce had been exhausting, that she wanted to travel without obligations. She spent the summer moving between Paris, London, and the French Riviera, staying in hotels and attending parties where she knew no one. At a dinner in Cannes, she was seated beside Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow's cousin, a German nobleman named Count Friedrich von Bismarck. He was tall, reserved, and uninterested in Barbara until someone mentioned her name and its connection to the Woolworth fortune. His demeanor changed immediately. He began asking questions: where she was staying, how long she would remain in France, whether she had plans for the following week. They began an affair that lasted 3 months. He visited her hotel suite in the afternoons, staying for hours before leaving without explanation. He never took her to public places, never introduced her to his friends, never suggested they might have a future together. When Barbara mentioned this, he explained that his family would not approve of an American, that German aristocracy maintained certain standards, that she should understand the complications. She did not press further. In September, he informed her that he was returning to Germany. His family had arranged a marriage to a woman from an appropriate background. He would be leaving within the week. He thanked Barbara for her companionship and suggested they might see each other again, if circumstances allowed. She never heard from him again. Barbara returned to New York in October. Lance had grown during her absence, his face fuller, his vocabulary expanded. He called the head nurse Mama and looked at Barbara with polite confusion when she entered the nursery. The nurse corrected him, reminding him that this was his mother, but Lance did not seem convinced. Barbara stayed for 15 minutes, watching him play with wooden blocks, then excused herself and returned to her suite. In November 1938, Barbara met Cary Grant at a party in Los Angeles. She had traveled to California for the opening of a friend's art gallery, an event that attracted film actors and industry executives. Grant was 34, handsome, famous, and unlike the European aristocrats who had pursued her. He came from a working-class background in England, had built his career through talent rather than inheritance, and earned his own money. They spoke for an hour at the party. He was charming without being obsequious, funny without seeming desperate to impress her. He asked about her interests, listened to her answers, and did not mention her wealth. When the party ended, he asked if he might take her to dinner the following evening. She agreed. They dated for 6 months before he proposed. During that time, he paid for every meal, every show, every outing. Barbara offered repeatedly to contribute, but he refused, explaining that he had been raised to believe a man supported the woman he cared for. She found the gesture both strange and reassuring. For the first time, someone wanted to give her something rather than take. They married on July 8, 1942, at the home of Barbara's attorney in Lake Arrowhead, California. The ceremony was private, attended by 12 people. Barbara wore a simple blue dress. Grant wore a suit he had owned for years. There was no reception, no announcement to the newspapers, no photographers. They spent their wedding night at a rented cabin in the mountains, where Grant cooked dinner and Barbara fell asleep on the couch while he cleaned the dishes. The marriage began well. Grant worked long hours at the studio, filming pictures that required early morning calls and late evening shoots. Barbara stayed at their rented house in Beverly Hills, reading and painting, and attempting to redecorate rooms that did not feel like hers. She saw Lance during his school holidays when he traveled from the East Coast boarding school where he had been enrolled at age 6. The visits were brief and awkward. Lance called her mother with the formality of a stranger addressing someone important. Grant was kind to Lance during these visits, teaching him card games and taking him to baseball games, but the boy remained distant. He spoke about his school friends, his teachers, his plans for summer vacation, none of which included Barbara. When the visits ended, Lance returned to school without looking back as the car pulled away. Barbara's drinking increased during the first year of marriage. She had always consumed alcohol socially, champagne at dinners and cocktails at parties, but the quantities grew. She began drinking alone in the afternoons, gin with minimal tonic, sitting in the living room and watching light move across the walls. By evening, she would be unsteady, her speech slurred. Grant would return from the studio and find her on the couch, glass in hand, the bottle half empty on the table beside her. He tried to help. He suggested they spend more time together, that she accompany him to film sets, that she find activities to occupy her days. Barbara agreed, but followed through on nothing. She attended a film shoot once, sitting in a canvas chair while Grant performed the same scene repeatedly. She left after an hour, feeling useless and conspicuous. Grant suggested she see a doctor. Barbara refused, insisting she was fine, that she drank no more than anyone else in their social circle. He pointed out that their friends drank at parties, not alone at noon. She told him to mind his business. The conversation ended in silence. By their second anniversary, they were living separate lives within the same house. Grant worked constantly, accepting every role offered to extend his time away from home. Barbara spent her days alone, drinking and sleeping, and occasionally seeing visitors who came out of obligation rather than friendship. When Grant suggested marriage counseling, Barbara laughed. When he suggested a trial separation, she agreed immediately. They divorced in August 1945. The proceedings were cordial. Grant asked for nothing, refused the financial settlement Barbara's attorneys offered, and signed the papers without negotiation. In later interviews, he spoke about Barbara only once, telling a reporter that she had been the most unhappy person he had ever known, that her wealth had made genuine connection impossible, that he hoped she would find peace. Barbara did not respond to the comment. After the divorce, Barbara left California and returned to New York. She took a suite at the Plaza Hotel, more spacious than the St. Regis, but equally impermanent. Lance was 9 years old, enrolled at a boarding school in Connecticut. She visited him twice during the school year, arriving in a chauffeured car and taking him to lunch at a nearby inn. They sat across from each other in silence, Lance eating his food methodically while Barbara pushed hers around the plate. She asked about his studies. He answered in monosyllables. She asked if he needed anything. He said no. The visits lasted less than an hour. In 1947, Barbara met Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian aristocrat living in exile after the Bolshevik Revolution. He was 52, had no money, and claimed ownership of estates that no longer existed. They met at a dinner party in Manhattan where he spent the evening describing his family's lost palaces and his childhood among Russian royalty. Barbara found his stories romantic in a way that felt detached from reality, like listening to fairy tales. They married in March 1947 in a civil ceremony at City Hall. No guests attended. Barbara wore a wool suit. The prince wore a borrowed tie. They honeymooned at her rented estate in Palm Beach, where the prince drank heavily and spent afternoons drafting letters to European governments requesting restitution for seized properties. The replies, when they came, were form letters explaining that such claims were not being processed. The marriage lasted 2 years. The prince developed a morphine addiction, sourcing the drug from doctors who asked no questions when paid sufficiently. He spent days in bed, emerging only for meals and to request money for unnamed expenses. Barbara's attorneys eventually cut off his access to her accounts. He filed for divorce in 1949, demanding a settlement. Barbara's lawyers offered $50,000. He accepted. Lance was 12 years old when his father appeared at his boarding school unannounced. Count von Haugwitz Reventlow had not visited in 3 years, had sent no letters, had made no attempt at contact beyond signing documents his attorneys forwarded. He arrived in a rented car, wearing a suit that looked expensive but showed signs of wear. The headmaster called Lance out of class and brought him to the visitor's parlor, where his father waited with a smile that looked practiced. The Count explained that he wanted to re-establish their relationship, that he regretted his absence, that a boy needed his father. Lance, who had learned politeness from years of institutional living, nodded and said little. The Count asked about his studies, his friends, his interests. Lance answered briefly. The visit lasted 30 minutes. As the Count prepared to leave, he mentioned that he was experiencing temporary financial difficulties and wondered if Lance might speak to his mother about increasing the support payments. Lance said he would try. He did not mention the visit to Barbara. When the Count called the school a week later, Lance told the headmaster he was unavailable. The Count stopped calling. Barbara visited Lance that spring, arriving at the school on a Saturday afternoon. She had called ahead, arranging lunch at the same inn they always visited. Lance met her in the parking lot, taller than he had been 6 months earlier, his voice beginning to deepen. They drove in silence. At the inn, Barbara ordered for both of them without asking what he wanted. Lance ate mechanically, answering her questions about school with the minimum required detail. Barbara asked if he would like to spend the summer with her. She had rented a house in Southampton on the beach, with room for him and a friend if he wanted to invite someone. Lance said he had already made plans to attend a summer program in Vermont, a wilderness camp that emphasized self-sufficiency and outdoor skills. Barbara had not known about the program. She asked who had arranged it. Lance said the headmaster had recommended it, and her attorneys had approved the expense. She felt something collapse inside her chest, but kept her expression neutral. She told Lance the camp sounded wonderful, that she hoped he would enjoy it. He thanked her politely. They finished their meal in silence. On the drive back to school, Lance stared out the window. Barbara searched for something to say and found nothing. When they arrived, he thanked her for lunch and walked toward the dormitory without looking back. Barbara returned to New York and called her attorneys. She asked why she had not been informed about the summer camp, why decisions about her son were being made without her knowledge. The attorney explained gently that she had signed documents years earlier granting them authority to make such arrangements, that the decisions had been in Lance's best interest, that she had never objected to this arrangement before. Barbara hung up without responding. She increased her drinking. The hotel suite became a place she rarely left. Room service delivered meals she did not eat. She slept through mornings and woke in the afternoons disoriented, unsure what day it was. Her social calendar, never full, emptied completely. Invitations still arrived, but she declined them all or simply did not respond. In the summer of 1950, Barbara met Porfirio Rubirosa at a party in Paris. She had traveled to Europe again, ostensibly to visit friends, actually to escape the emptiness of her New York routine. Rubirosa was a Dominican diplomat and professional playboy, famous for his affairs with wealthy women and his expensive tastes. He was handsome in an obvious way, charismatic in a manner that felt rehearsed. He approached Barbara within minutes of her arrival at the party. They spoke briefly. He complimented her dress, asked where she was staying, suggested they have dinner the following evening. Barbara agreed, knowing exactly what he was and not caring. The next night, he took her to a restaurant where waiters knew him by name, and the bill was discreetly added to a running account. He ordered champagne and spoke about his work in the diplomatic corps, describing negotiations and state functions with details that sounded invented. Barbara found his company easy. He asked nothing of her emotionally, demanded no vulnerability, required no real connection. They spent their evenings at nightclubs and their nights at her hotel. He was attentive in bed in a way that felt professional, skillful, but detached. When morning came, he dressed and left without lingering, returning that evening to repeat the pattern. After 3 weeks, he proposed. They were sitting in her suite, drinking cognac at 2 a.m. He took her hand and told her he had fallen in love with her, that he wanted to marry her, that he could make her happy. Barbara looked at his face and saw nothing behind the words, but she agreed anyway. They were married in December 1953 in New York, a civil ceremony followed by a reception for 200 guests at the Pierre Hotel. The marriage lasted 73 days. Rubirosa spent her money with astonishing speed. A plane, a plantation in the Dominican Republic, polo ponies, cars, jewelry for women Barbara never met. When she questioned the expenses, he accused her of being possessive, of trying to control him, of not understanding what marriage meant. She filed for divorce in February 1954. The settlement included a house in Paris, a coffee plantation, a stable of polo ponies, several cars, and a reported $1 million in cash. Rubirosa signed the papers with visible satisfaction. After the divorce, Barbara remained in Paris. She rented an apartment on the left bank, a fourth-floor walk-up with tall windows and creaking floors. She began painting again, something she had not done since her finishing school days. The paintings were abstract, dark colors applied in heavy layers that obscured rather than revealed. She worked at night, drinking wine and listening to records while the paint dried. She did not exhibit the work or show it to anyone. The canvases accumulated in the spare bedroom, stacked against the walls, facing inward so she did not have to look at them. Lance graduated from boarding school in 1954. He enrolled at Bennington College in Vermont, a progressive institution that emphasized independent study and artistic development. Barbara attended the graduation ceremony, sitting in the back row of the auditorium while Lance's name was called. He walked across the stage, accepted his diploma, and returned to his seat without scanning the audience. Afterward, Barbara approached him outside, congratulating him and asking about his college plans. Lance answered briefly, his attention on friends who were waiting nearby. He introduced Barbara to no one. When she suggested dinner to celebrate, he explained that he had other commitments. She gave him a check for $10,000 and watched him fold it into his pocket without looking at the amount. At Bennington, Lance studied literature and philosophy. He wrote letters to Barbara twice a year, brief updates on his academic progress and requests for expense money. The letters were polite but impersonal, written in the tone one might use with a distant benefactor. Barbara responded with longer letters, describing her life in Paris, asking about his studies. Expressing hope that they might visit during his school breaks, Lance replied only to the practical questions, ignoring everything else. During his sophomore year, Lance stopped using the name Reventlow. He began introducing himself as Lance Hutton, dropping his father's title entirely. When Barbara learned of this through her attorneys, she felt a complicated mixture of relief and grief. Her son had rejected his father's name, but had not chosen hers either. He had taken the Woolworth name, the one that carried the inheritance, but none of the intimacy. In 1955, Barbara married Baron Gottfried von Cram, a German tennis champion she had met at a tournament in Monte Carlo. He was 46, handsome, refined, and widely rumored to be homosexual. Barbara knew the rumors. She married him anyway, seeking companionship rather than passion, someone who would attend social functions and share her homes without demanding emotional access. The marriage was chaste and functional. Von Cram lived in the Paris apartment when he was not traveling for tennis exhibitions. They dined together occasionally, attended parties as a couple, and maintained separate bedrooms. He was polite and distant, treating the marriage as a professional arrangement. Barbara found this preferable to the alternative she had experienced. The arrangement lasted 3 years. In 1958, Von Cram informed Barbara that he had met someone, a younger man with whom he wanted to live openly. He asked for a divorce. Barbara granted it without requesting a settlement or fighting the terms. They parted amicably. He sent her flowers on her birthday for years afterward. Lance visited Barbara once during this period. He was 21, on break from college, traveling through Europe with friends. He called from a hotel in Paris and asked if he might stop by her apartment. Barbara prepared for the visit obsessively, buying food she thought he might like, arranging flowers in every room, rehearsing conversation topics. When he arrived, he was accompanied by 2 classmates, a young man and woman who introduced themselves and immediately began discussing their itinerary for the rest of the trip. The visit lasted 40 minutes. Lance was polite but restless, standing near the door rather than sitting, checking his watch periodically. His friends asked Barbara about Paris, about good restaurants and museums, treating her as a local resource rather than Lance's mother. When they prepared to leave, Lance thanked her and said he would write when he returned to school. He did not write. Barbara hired a private investigator in 1959 to report on Lance's activities. She told herself it was concern, a mother wanting to ensure her son's well-being. The investigator's reports arrived monthly, detailing Lance's movements, his friendships, his romantic relationships. He was seeing a girl from his philosophy class. He had joined a literary magazine. He spent weekends hiking in the mountains with friends. The reports contained nothing alarming, but Barbara read them repeatedly, searching for some indication that he thought of her, that he missed her, that she existed in his life as more than a source of money. The investigator's final report, delivered in December 1959, noted that Lance had been asking friends about legal procedures for emancipation, about whether an adult could formally sever ties with a parent, about what obligations remained if inheritance was refused. Barbara stopped reading halfway through. She dismissed the investigator and burned the reports in her fireplace. Lance graduated from Bennington in 1960. Barbara was not informed of the ceremony and did not attend. She learned about it from a notice in the alumni newsletter her attorneys received. Lance moved to San Francisco after graduation, renting an apartment in North Beach and working at a bookstore while writing poetry. He did not inform Barbara of the move. She learned his address through her attorneys, who continued to manage his trust fund. Barbara wrote him a letter in the fall of 1960. She apologized for her failures as a mother, acknowledged her absences, expressed regret for the distance between them. She asked if they might correspond, if he might visit, if there was any possibility of rebuilding their relationship. She mailed the letter and waited for a response. 3 months later, the letter was returned unopened, marked "Return to Sender," in handwriting she recognized as Lance's. Barbara began painting in earnest in 1961. She rented a studio in Montparnasse, a narrow space on the 5th floor of a building with no elevator. The room had northern light and water-stained walls. The previous tenant had been a sculptor who left behind broken plaster molds and dried clay. Barbara paid to have the debris removed and installed an easel near the window. She worked without instruction or plan. The paintings emerged in layers. Thick applications of oil paint built up over days, colors chosen for their darkness rather than their harmony. She painted figures that dissolved into abstraction, landscapes that suggested nothing recognizable, shapes that seemed to press against the canvas from behind. The work was violent in its application, the brushstrokes aggressive, the palette limited to blacks, grays, and browns. She painted every afternoon, arriving at the studio at 2 and working until the light faded. She brought no food, no water, only cigarettes and a bottle of whatever she was drinking that week. The process consumed her attention in a way nothing else did. While painting, she did not think about Lance, about her marriages, about the hotel suite waiting for her across the city. The canvas demanded presence, and for a few hours each day she could provide it. After 6 months, she had completed 30 canvases. She stacked them against the studio walls, facing inward, and began new ones. She did not photograph them or show them to anyone. When the concierge of her building asked what she was working on, Barbara said it was a hobby, nothing serious. In early 1962, a gallery owner named Michel Rousseau visited the studio. He had been told about Barbara by a mutual acquaintance, someone who had mentioned that the Woolworth heiress was painting and might be interested in showing her work. Rousseau arrived unannounced one afternoon, climbing the 5 flights and knocking while Barbara was mid-canvas. She opened the door with paint on her hands and annoyance on her face. Rousseau introduced himself and asked to see her work. Barbara hesitated, then stepped aside. He entered the studio and turned the canvases around, one by one, studying each for several minutes. Barbara stood by the window smoking, watching his face for a reaction. When he finished, he asked if she had formal training. She said no. He asked how long she had been painting. She said less than a year. He told her the work was raw but interesting, that it showed genuine feeling, that she had an instinct for composition despite the lack of technical refinement. He suggested she consider exhibiting, perhaps in a group show with other emerging artists. Barbara asked if he would show the work based on its quality, or based on her name. Rousseau paused before answering. He said both, if he was being honest. Her name would attract attention, but he would not exhibit work he considered worthless, regardless of who painted it. Barbara told him to leave. Rousseau apologized, explaining that he had meant no offense, that this was simply the reality of the art world. She opened the door and waited until he left. She continued painting, but abandoned the idea of exhibiting. The work remained in the studio, unseen except by Barbara herself. Over the next 2 years, the number of completed canvases grew to over 100. She rented a storage space to hold them, a basement room in a building near the studio. She hired movers to transport the paintings, instructing them to stack the canvases face to face so the images were hidden. In 1963, Barbara began writing. She had kept journals sporadically throughout her life, but this was different. She was attempting fiction, stories about women who lived in unnamed cities and suffered in ways she could describe, but not explain. The prose was dense, the narrative circular, the endings unresolved. She wrote longhand in notebooks she bought from a stationery store near her apartment, filling pages with crossed-out lines and marginal revisions. She completed a short story in 3 months. The piece was 20 pages, about a woman who attends the same party repeatedly, each time hoping for a different outcome, each time experiencing the same humiliation. Barbara retyped it on a borrowed typewriter and submitted it to a literary magazine in New York, using a pseudonym. The submission was rejected with a form letter. She submitted it to 4 more magazines. All rejected it. She wrote another story, this one about a mother who loses custody of her child and spends years trying to reconstruct what happened. The narrative was fragmented, jumping between past and present without clear transitions. Barbara submitted it to 6 magazines. 5 rejected it. The 6th, a small quarterly published in Chicago, accepted it but asked if she would consider revisions to clarify the timeline and strengthen the ending. Barbara agreed. She spent a month reworking the story, adding transitional passages and providing a resolution she did not believe. The magazine published it in their winter 1964 issue under the name Barbara Lawrence. The issue had a print run of 800 copies. Barbara received 2 contributor copies and no payment. She continued writing and submitting, always under pseudonyms, always to small magazines that paid nothing or very little. Most of the work was rejected. Occasionally, a piece was accepted, appearing months later in publications with circulations too small to matter. Barbara collected the magazines when they arrived, reading her stories in print and finding them strange, as though written by someone else. In 1965, a publisher approached her about writing a memoir. The offer came through her attorneys, who forwarded the letter with a note suggesting she consider it. The publisher proposed a book about her life, her childhood, her marriages, her experiences as an heiress. They promised editorial support, a substantial advance, and a major publicity campaign. The letter estimated potential sales in the hundreds of thousands. Barbara declined. She wrote back explaining that she had no interest in publishing under her own name, that her life was not suitable material for public consumption, that she preferred to keep writing fiction anonymously. The publisher responded with a revised offer, suggesting she could write the memoir under a pseudonym, that readers would not need to know the author's identity. Barbara did not reply. Her paintings and stories accumulated, filling storage spaces and desk drawers. The work existed in a parallel world, separate from her public identity, unseen by anyone who knew her real name. She exhibited nothing, published nothing under her own name, sought no recognition. When acquaintances asked how she spent her time, she said she traveled, that she read, that she kept busy with nothing in particular. In 1966, Barbara met a young art student named Françoise Duval at a café near her studio. Françoise was 23, enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts, struggling to afford materials and rent. They began talking after Barbara noticed Françoise sketching in a notebook. Barbara asked to see the drawings. Françoise showed her reluctantly. Charcoal studies of hands, faces, architectural details. Barbara asked if she could buy one. Françoise looked confused, then suspicious, wondering if this older American woman was mocking her. Barbara clarified that she was serious, that she would pay 50 francs for a drawing of her choice. Françoise agreed, still uncertain. Barbara selected a study of a woman's hands, holding a cigarette, and paid in cash. They began meeting regularly at the cafe. Barbara bought more drawings, paying prices far above what the work was worth. Françoise accepted the money, but seemed uncomfortable, as though she understood she was receiving charity rather than patronage. After their 5th meeting, she asked Barbara why she was doing this. Barbara said she liked the work. Françoise asked if there was more to it. Barbara admitted she had been an art student herself once, that she had abandoned it, that helping someone else felt like repairing something she had broken. Françoise invited Barbara to visit her studio, a converted attic she shared with 2 other students. The space was cramped and cold, lit by a single skylight. Canvases leaned against every wall. The smell of turpentine was overwhelming. Françoise showed Barbara her recent work, abstract compositions in bright colors, energetic and unfinished. Barbara studied them carefully, offering observations about composition and color relationships. Françoise listened, then asked if Barbara painted. Barbara hesitated before answering yes. Françoise asked to see her work. Barbara said it was not ready to be shown. Françoise did not press. Over the following months, Barbara supported Françoise financially, paying her rent and buying her materials without expecting anything in return. Françoise's work improved, her confidence growing alongside her technical skill. In the spring of 1967, she was accepted into a group exhibition at a small gallery in the Marais. Barbara attended the opening, standing in the back while Françoise spoke with collectors and critics. Several pieces sold. Françoise was elated. After the exhibition, Françoise invited Barbara to dinner to celebrate. Over wine, she thanked Barbara for her support and asked again to see Barbara's work. Barbara deflected, saying it was private, that she painted for herself. Françoise asked why Barbara hid what she made. Barbara said it was easier that way, that being taken seriously required anonymity, and that her name made real judgment impossible. Françoise argued that Barbara was wrong, that good work would be recognized regardless of who made it, that she should have more faith in her own abilities. Barbara smiled and said nothing. The conversation moved on. A week later, Barbara stopped visiting the cafe. She sent Françoise a final payment, enough to cover 6 months of rent and materials, with a note wishing her success. Françoise wrote back, asking if she had done something wrong, if Barbara was upset. Barbara did not respond. She returned to her studio alone and continued painting. The canvases grew darker, the figures more obscured, the surfaces more layered. She worked faster now, completing paintings in single sessions, attacking the canvas with an urgency that left her exhausted. The work was angrier than before, less controlled, more willing to fail. By the end of 1967, she had filled 2 storage spaces. She calculated that she had completed over 300 paintings in 6 years. None had been exhibited, none had been sold, none had been seen by anyone except Rousseau, and he had viewed fewer than 50. She continued anyway, arriving at the studio each afternoon, painting until dark, returning to her apartment to drink and sleep. The routine held. The work continued. No one knew she was making it. Barbara returned to New York in 1968. She had lived in Paris for nearly a decade, and the city had stopped feeling like an escape. The apartment lease was ending. Her attorney suggested she return to the United States for tax reasons, to re-establish residency and address estate planning matters that required her physical presence. She agreed without enthusiasm. She took a suite at the Pierre Hotel, a large apartment on the 35th floor with views of Central Park. The furniture was ornate and impersonal, chosen by decorators decades earlier. Barbara lived among it without changing anything, as though occupying someone else's space temporarily. Her paintings remained in Paris storage. She brought none of them back. Lance was 32 years old and living in Hawaii. He had moved there in 1966, buying a small house near the ocean with money from his trust fund. He worked part-time at a surf shop and spent his days swimming and reading. Barbara learned these details from her attorneys, who maintained contact with Lance's financial advisors. She had not spoken to him in 8 years. In New York, Barbara fell into a routine that resembled her Paris life but felt emptier. She woke late, ate little, drank steadily throughout the afternoon. She attended no social events, accepted no invitations, saw no friends. The hotel staff brought her meals and newspapers. She read neither. The newspapers piled up on the console table in the entryway, unfolded and yellowing. In the fall of 1968, she was contacted by a fashion designer named James Fenwick. He had been recommended by one of her attorneys, who thought Barbara might be interested in his proposal. Fenwick wanted to launch a line of women's clothing under Barbara's name, targeting middle-class consumers who aspired to her lifestyle. The clothes would be elegant but affordable, sold in department stores rather than boutiques. He believed Barbara's name would guarantee sales. Barbara agreed to meet him. Fenwick arrived at the Pierre with sketches and fabric samples, spreading them across the coffee table while explaining his vision. The clothing would be classic, sophisticated, timeless, pieces that evoked old money without the price tag. He spoke about market research, about consumer psychology, about the power of aspiration. Barbara listened without much interest. When he finished, she asked what he needed from her. Fenwick explained that he needed her name, her image, and her approval of the designs. She would not need to be involved in the day-to-day operations, the manufacturing, or the distribution. She would attend a few promotional events, pose for advertisements, and sign off on the seasonal collections. In exchange, she would receive a percentage of net profits. Barbara asked what percentage. Fenwick said 5%. Barbara's attorney, who had accompanied Fenwick to the meeting, suggested 10. Fenwick agreed after minimal negotiation. Contracts were drawn up. Barbara signed them without reading past the first page. The line launched in the spring of 1969. The initial collection included dresses, blouses, skirts, and evening wear, all bearing labels that read Barbara Hutton. The price points were high for department store merchandise, but accessible compared to designer boutiques. The marketing campaign featured photographs of Barbara from the 1930s and 40s, images of her at parties and galas, always elegant, always perfectly dressed. The contemporary Barbara, 56 years old and bloated from alcohol, did not appear. The clothing sold immediately. Department stores reordered within weeks. Fenwick expanded the line to include accessories, handbags, scarves, jewelry. Everything carried Barbara's name. Women who could never afford her lifestyle could now buy a piece of it for $30. Barbara attended the launch event at Bergdorf Goodman, a reception for buyers and press. She wore a dress from the collection selected by Fenwick's team and stood near the entrance while photographers took pictures. Reporters asked questions about her inspiration, her design philosophy, her vision for the brand. Barbara answered with phrases Fenwick had written for her on index cards. After an hour, she excused herself and left through a side exit. The press coverage was extensive. Magazines praised the collection for its accessibility and elegance. They interviewed women who had purchased the clothes, asking what it meant to wear something designed by Barbara Hutton. The customers spoke about feeling sophisticated, about aspiring to a certain lifestyle, about the prestige of the name. None mentioned Barbara herself. They spoke about the idea of her, the fantasy she represented. Sales doubled in the second year. Fenwick expanded into international markets, opening accounts in London, Paris, and Rome. The brand became synonymous with affordable luxury, a contradiction that somehow worked. Barbara's name appeared in advertisements, on clothing labels, and department store displays across the world. She received royalty checks quarterly, deposits made directly into accounts managed by her attorneys. The amounts were substantial, but meaningless. She already had more money than she could spend. Fenwick asked her to attend more promotional events. Barbara declined most of them, citing health issues and travel fatigue. She attended twice more over the next 3 years, once at a store opening in Chicago, once at a charity fashion show in Los Angeles. Both times she appeared briefly, posed for photographs, and left as quickly as possible. Reporters noted that she looked unwell, that she had gained weight, that she seemed uncomfortable in her own clothes. In 1971, a journalist from Women's Wear Daily requested an interview about the fashion line. Barbara's publicist, hired by Fenwick to manage her image, forwarded the request with a recommendation to accept. Barbara refused. The publicist explained that refusing would generate negative press, that the brand's success depended on Barbara remaining visible and accessible. Barbara said she did not care about the brand's success. The publicist resigned. Fenwick hired a new publicist and scheduled the interview without Barbara's explicit approval. The journalist arrived at the Pierre at the appointed time. Barbara refused to see her. The journalist waited in the lobby for 2 hours before leaving. She wrote an article about the experience, describing the disconnect between Barbara Hutton, the brand, and Barbara Hutton, the woman. The article suggested that the clothing line was profiting from a ghost, that the real Barbara had disappeared years ago, that what remained was only a name. Sales were not affected. If anything, the article generated more interest. The idea of Barbara as a tragic figure, a woman who had retreated from the world she represented, made the brand more appealing. Customers bought the clothes not despite Barbara's absence, but because of it. They were purchasing a mythology, not a person. By 1972, the Barbara Hutton line was generating over $10 million in annual revenue. Fenwick proposed expanding into home goods, linens, tableware, decorative objects. Barbara approved the expansion through her attorneys, never meeting with Fenwick to discuss it. The home collection launched in 1973 and sold as well as the clothing. Barbara's royalty payments increased accordingly. Her attorneys invested the money, diversifying her portfolio and protecting her assets. She never looked at the statements, never asked about the investments, never engaged with the machinery that was converting her name into profit. The money accumulated in accounts she did not access, managed by people she did not know. In 1974, a documentary filmmaker approached Barbara about making a film about her life. The proposal came through her attorneys, who had been contacted by the filmmaker's production company. The film would explore Barbara's role in American culture, her influence on fashion and society, her significance as a 20th century icon. The filmmaker promised sensitivity and control, offering Barbara final approval over all content. Barbara refused immediately. She wrote a letter to her attorneys instructing them to decline all future requests for interviews, documentaries, biographies, or any other project that involved her participation or required access to her life. The letter was brief and unambiguous. Her attorneys filed it and forwarded the refusal to the filmmaker. The fashion line continued without her involvement. Fenwick released new collections seasonally, always using Barbara's name, always marketing to women who wanted to embody the elegance she supposedly represented. Barbara never wore the clothes except at the promotional events she could not avoid. In private, she wore the same things she had worn for years: simple dresses bought without attention to style, comfortable shoes, no jewelry. The disconnect between Barbara Hutton, the brand, and Barbara Hutton, the person, grew wider with each passing year. The brand evolved, adapted to changing tastes, remained relevant in ways the woman herself did not. Store windows displayed mannequins wearing her name. Magazine advertisements promised sophistication and grace. The real Barbara spent her days in a hotel suite, drinking and sleeping and avoiding the world that had turned her into something she did not recognize. In 1975, Fenwick asked Barbara to attend the brand's 10th anniversary celebration. A gala was planned at the Plaza Hotel, with buyers, press, and celebrities expected to attend. Fenwick wrote personally, explaining how much her presence would mean, how important it was for her to be seen supporting the brand that bore her name. Barbara did not respond. On the night of the gala, Barbara remained in her suite at the Pierre. She could see the plaza from her window, its lights visible across the park. She sat by the window with a drink, watching limousines arrive and guests enter the hotel. The party lasted until midnight. Barbara watched until the last car departed, then went to bed. The fashion line continued for another decade. By the time it was discontinued in 1985, it had generated over $100 million in revenue. Barbara had received millions in royalties, money that was added to accounts she never touched, invested in ways she never questioned. The brand had been successful by every measure except the one that mattered. It had made her more famous and more alone, more visible and more invisible. Her name had become something that belonged to other people, something they could buy and wear and discard without ever knowing her. In 1976, Barbara moved from the Pierre to a townhouse on East 78th Street. The property had belonged to a banking family whose fortune had collapsed during the 1974 recession. Barbara's attorneys purchased it at a reduced price, sight unseen, and hired decorators to furnish it before she arrived. The house was 5 stories, with servants' quarters on the top floor and a private garden behind a brick wall. Barbara occupied the second floor, using only the bedroom and an adjacent sitting room. The other floors remained largely empty, rooms furnished but unused, halls that echoed when she walked through them at night. She hired a minimal staff, a housekeeper who came 3 times a week, a cook who prepared meals she rarely ate, a driver she almost never called. The isolation deepened. She stopped answering the telephone. Mail accumulated in the entrance hall, sorted by the housekeeper into categories Barbara never reviewed. Invitations, requests for donations, letters from strangers, all went unanswered. Her attorneys managed everything that required a response. She signed documents when they were brought to her and returned them without asking what they concerned. Lance called once in 1977. The housekeeper answered and asked Barbara if she wanted to take the call. Barbara stood in the hallway, looking at the telephone on the console table, and said no. The housekeeper relayed that Mrs. Hutton was unavailable. Lance did not call again. In the spring of 1978, Barbara's health deteriorated. She had been experiencing chest pain and shortness of breath for months, symptoms she ignored until they became impossible to dismiss. Her attorneys, alerted by the housekeeper, sent a physician to the townhouse. The doctor examined her and diagnosed severe malnutrition, liver damage from alcohol consumption, and early signs of heart disease. He recommended hospitalization. Barbara refused. The doctor explained that her condition was serious, that without treatment she was at significant risk. Barbara told him to leave. He wrote prescriptions for medications she did not fill and reported his findings to her attorneys, who filed the information and did nothing further. She hired a private nurse, a woman named Mrs. Eleanor Shaw, who had worked in hospitals before transitioning to private care. Mrs. Shaw moved into the townhouse's fourth floor and established a routine of monitoring Barbara's vital signs, administering medications the doctor had left despite Barbara's refusal to fill prescriptions, and ensuring she ate at least one meal per day. Barbara tolerated her presence but did not speak to her beyond what was necessary. Mrs. Shaw observed without commenting. She saw the empty bottles in the bedroom wastebasket, the untouched meals on trays, the way Barbara sat for hours staring at nothing. She documented everything in a notebook she kept locked in her room: Barbara's weight, her sleeping patterns, the progression of her symptoms. The notebook was later turned over to Barbara's attorneys and never made public. In 1979, Barbara received word that her father had died. Franklin Hutton was 89, had been living in California with his third wife, and had not seen Barbara in over 15 years. The notification came through her attorneys, along with information about the funeral arrangements and the terms of his will. Barbara had been left a token bequest, a collection of books from his library and a small piece of property in Connecticut she had never visited. The bulk of his estate went to his widow and stepchildren. Barbara did not attend the funeral. She sent flowers through a service and remained in the townhouse. When Mrs. Shaw asked if she was all right, Barbara said she was fine. That evening, she drank more than usual and fell asleep in the sitting room chair. Mrs. Shaw found her at midnight and helped her to bed. The 1980s brought no improvement. Barbara's weight fluctuated wildly, periods of severe restriction followed by weeks where she ate compulsively, consuming entire meals in minutes before vomiting afterward. Mrs. Shaw documented this pattern but could not prevent it. Barbara's appearance changed dramatically. Her face became gaunt, her skin sallow. She stopped wearing makeup, stopped caring about her clothes, stopped looking in mirrors. In 1982, Barbara learned that Lance had married. The information came from a brief mention in a society column her attorneys summarized in their monthly report. His wife's name was given as Jill St. John, though this was later corrected. It was actually a woman named Patricia, whom Lance had met in Hawaii. There were no details about a wedding, no announcement, no invitation extended to Barbara. She learned about her son's marriage the way she might learn about a stranger's. She wrote him a letter, the first communication she had attempted in over a decade. She congratulated him on his marriage, expressed regret for their estrangement, asked if they might reconnect. She included a check for $50,000 and mailed the letter to the address her attorneys provided. The check was cashed 3 weeks later. No response came. Barbara waited months before accepting that none would arrive. She stopped asking her attorneys about Lance after that, instructed them to remove him from their monthly reports unless something required her immediate attention. She did not want to know about his life if she could not be part of it. In 1983, Barbara met a man named Raymond Doan at a doctor's appointment. He was in the waiting room when she arrived, a thin man in his early 40s with graying hair and expensive shoes. They began talking while waiting, a casual conversation about nothing important. He was polite, educated, and when he learned who she was, he showed no particular reaction. This struck Barbara as unusual enough to continue the conversation. Doan explained that he was a painter, living in New York temporarily while preparing for an exhibition. He asked what brought her to the doctor. Barbara said she was managing a chronic condition, offering no details. Doan did not press. Instead, he mentioned that he was looking for gallery space, that the art world in New York was difficult to navigate, that he was considering returning to Europe where he had more connections. Barbara offered to help. She knew gallery owners, she said, people who owed her favors or who would take her calls. Doan seemed surprised but accepted gratefully. They exchanged telephone numbers. Barbara called him 2 days later and arranged an introduction to a gallery in Soho. Over the following months, Doan became a regular presence at the townhouse. He visited weekly, sometimes more frequently, always arriving in the late afternoon when the light was fading. He brought sketches to show Barbara, discussed his work, asked her opinion on compositions and color choices. She gave thoughtful answers, drawing on knowledge she had accumulated during her own years of painting. He seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts. The relationship shifted gradually. Doan began staying for dinner, then into the evening, then overnight. He moved some of his belongings into one of the unused guest rooms, explaining that his apartment lease was ending, and he needed time to find something suitable. Barbara told him he could stay as long as necessary. Mrs. Shaw observed the arrangement with disapproval but said nothing. She noticed that Doan never paid for anything, that his telephone calls appeared on Barbara's bills, that he requested items, art supplies, clothing, meals at expensive restaurants, which Barbara provided without question. She documented this in her notebook along with Barbara's vital signs. Doan's exhibition opened in January 1984 at a small gallery in Soho. Barbara attended the opening, one of the few times she had left the townhouse in months. The gallery was crowded, filled with people who seemed to know each other. Doan introduced Barbara to no one. He spent the evening circulating, speaking with collectors and critics, while Barbara stood alone near the entrance. The work did not sell well. A few pieces were purchased by friends of the gallery owner, but most remained unsold when the exhibition closed 3 weeks later. Doan seemed undiscouraged. He told Barbara that critical reception had been positive, that future opportunities would emerge, that building a career took time. Barbara agreed to continue supporting him. In the spring of 1984, Doan asked Barbara for money to purchase a studio space. He had found a property in Brooklyn, an old warehouse that could be converted into both living and working space. The price was reasonable, he explained, but he needed help with the down payment. Barbara instructed her attorneys to provide the funds. Doan purchased the property and moved out of the townhouse the following week. He continued to visit, though less frequently. His request for money became more specific: materials for a new series of paintings, travel expenses for an exhibition opportunity in Los Angeles, legal fees for a copyright dispute that was never fully explained. Barbara provided everything he asked for without asking questions. Mrs. Shaw mentioned to her once that Mr. Doan seemed to visit only when he needed something. Barbara told her the observation was unnecessary. In 1985, Doan stopped visiting altogether. His telephone calls became infrequent, then ceased entirely. Barbara called the Brooklyn studio several times, leaving messages that went unreturned. After 3 months of silence, she sent her driver to the address. The driver reported that the property had been sold, that new owners were renovating it, that they had no information about the previous resident. Barbara never saw Doan again. She learned later through her attorneys that he had sold the Brooklyn property for 3 times what he had paid, pocketing the profit. The attorneys estimated that Barbara had given him approximately $200,000 over 18 months. They asked if she wanted to pursue legal action. She said no. Barbara stopped leaving the townhouse in 1986. There was no specific event that precipitated the withdrawal, no crisis or conflict that forced the decision. She simply stopped going out. Doctor's appointments were canceled. The few social obligations remaining on her calendar were declined through her attorneys. The driver was dismissed. The townhouse became the boundary of her world. Mrs. Shaw remained, her presence the only constant. She maintained the routines Barbara could not, ensuring medications were taken, meals were prepared, the house was kept clean. She hired additional staff when necessary, managed the household accounts Barbara no longer reviewed, and served as the intermediary between Barbara and the world outside. The days became indistinguishable. Barbara woke late, usually after noon, and moved from the bedroom to the sitting room, where she spent hours in a chair by the window. The window overlooked the garden, a small rectangle of grass and overgrown shrubs surrounded by brick walls. She watched it through seasons: snow accumulating in winter, leaves appearing in spring, heat settling over everything in summer. The garden was never used. No one walked through it or tended it beyond minimal maintenance. She read occasionally, books brought from the library downstairs by Mrs. Shaw. The selections were random: novels Barbara had owned for decades, biographies of people she did not know, art books with color plates. She read without retaining, turning pages to occupy time rather than to absorb content. When she finished a book, she set it aside and forgot it immediately. The telephone rang rarely. When it did, Mrs. Shaw answered. Most calls were from attorneys with documents requiring signatures or decisions requiring approval. Barbara instructed Mrs. Shaw to handle everything, to sign her name when permitted, to make decisions based on whatever seemed reasonable. The attorneys complied, accustomed to managing clients who had withdrawn from active participation in their own affairs. Letters arrived daily, though in smaller quantities than before. Requests for donations, notifications about estate matters, occasional correspondence from people Barbara had known decades earlier. Mrs. Shaw sorted them into categories: urgent, routine, and irrelevant. The urgent pile was brought to Barbara weekly. She glanced through it without reading carefully, signing what needed signing, and ignoring the rest. In 1987, Barbara received a letter from Lance. It was brief, typed on plain paper, informing her that his marriage had ended in divorce. He provided no details about the circumstances, no explanation for why he was telling her, no request for contact. The letter concluded with a forwarding address in California and a line stating that future correspondence regarding estate matters should be sent there. Barbara read the letter 3 times, searching for something beyond the words. An invitation, an opening, an indication that he wanted more than updated mailing information. She found nothing. She filed the letter in a desk drawer and did not respond. Her drinking, which had been steady for decades, increased in both quantity and frequency. She began drinking in the mornings, vodka mixed with orange juice, consuming the first glass before getting out of bed. By afternoon, she had switched to wine. By evening, she was drinking bourbon or scotch, whatever Mrs. Shaw had stocked in the cabinet. She rarely appeared intoxicated. The alcohol was too constant for that. Instead, she existed in a permanent state of mild sedation, her movements slow, her speech slightly slurred, her memory unreliable. Mrs. Shaw documented the drinking, but did not intervene. She had attempted once in 1985 to suggest that Barbara might benefit from reducing her consumption. Barbara had responded with cold fury, telling Mrs. Shaw that her opinions were neither requested nor welcome, that she was employed to provide medical care, not moral judgment. Mrs. Shaw had not mentioned it again. In 1988, Barbara fell on the stairs. She had been descending to the first floor, moving carefully because her vision had been blurring when she missed a step and tumbled down the remaining 7. Mrs. Shaw found her at the bottom, conscious but unable to stand. The fall had broken her left wrist and bruised her ribs severely. Mrs. Shaw called an ambulance despite Barbara's protests. At the hospital, doctors treated the fracture and examined Barbara's overall condition. They noted severe malnutrition, liver damage, osteoporosis, and evidence of previous falls that had gone unreported. They recommended extended hospitalization for observation and treatment. Barbara refused. She demanded to be released, threatened legal action when the doctors hesitated, and signed forms acknowledging that she was leaving against medical advice. Mrs. Shaw brought her home in a taxi. Barbara's wrist was in a cast, her ribs wrapped tightly. She moved slowly, in visible pain, but refused medication stronger than aspirin. She returned to the sitting room chair and resumed her routine as though nothing had happened. The cast was removed 6 weeks later. The wrist healed poorly, leaving her with limited mobility and chronic pain she never mentioned. The fall marked the beginning of a physical decline that accelerated over the following years. Barbara's weight dropped below 90 pounds. Her hair thinned and grayed. Her skin took on a translucent quality, veins visible beneath the surface. She moved with difficulty, her joints stiff, her balance unreliable. Mrs. Shaw installed handrails in the hallways and bathroom, placed non-slip mats on the floors, and removed furniture that might present obstacles. Barbara noticed these changes but said nothing. She adapted her movements to accommodate her body's limitations, holding walls for support, taking stairs one at a time, avoiding sudden motions that might cause her to fall. She accepted the handrails and the mats without comment, understanding that Mrs. Shaw was trying to help even if the help came too late to matter. In 1989, Barbara began seeing figures in the garden. She mentioned this to Mrs. Shaw casually one afternoon, noting that someone had been walking through the shrubs. Mrs. Shaw looked out the window and saw nothing. She asked Barbara to describe what she had seen. Barbara said it was a woman in a dark dress moving slowly along the wall. Mrs. Shaw checked the garden and found no evidence of anyone having been there. The sightings continued. Barbara reported them irregularly, sometimes daily, sometimes not for weeks. The figure was always the same, always a woman, always dressed in dark clothing. Sometimes Barbara claimed the woman was watching the house. Other times she said the woman was looking for something. Mrs. Shaw began to suspect hallucinations, a symptom of Barbara's deteriorating health or the cumulative effects of decades of alcohol consumption. She contacted Barbara's attorneys, who consulted with physicians. The doctors recommended a neurological evaluation. Barbara refused to be examined. Mrs. Shaw documented the hallucinations in her notebook, noting their frequency and Barbara's descriptions. The attorneys filed the information and took no further action. By 1990, Barbara had stopped recognizing some of the household staff. The housekeeper, who had worked in the townhouse for over a decade, became a stranger Barbara asked to identify herself. The cook was mistaken for a previous employee who had left years earlier. Mrs. Shaw herself was occasionally confused with nurses from Barbara's past, women whose names Mrs. Shaw did not recognize. These confusions passed quickly. Barbara would realize her error within minutes, apologizing without explanation and resuming normal interaction. But their frequency increased, and Mrs. Shaw began to understand that Barbara's mind was failing alongside her body. In the fall of 1990, Barbara asked Mrs. Shaw to bring her the paintings from storage. She was referring to the canvases she had left in Paris 15 years earlier, hundreds of paintings she had not seen since. Mrs. Shaw contacted the attorneys, who investigated and discovered that the storage fees had not been paid in over a decade. The facility had disposed of the contents years earlier, following standard procedure for abandoned property. When Mrs. Shaw explained this to Barbara, she showed no reaction. She sat in her chair, looking out at the garden, and said she understood. That evening, she drank more than usual. Mrs. Shaw found her asleep in the sitting room at 3 in the morning, an empty bottle on the floor beside her chair. The paintings were gone. The stories she had written under pseudonyms had been published in magazines that no longer existed, read by people who had never known her name. The art she had made and the words she had written had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. Nothing she had created had survived. Barbara stopped talking about the past after that. She stopped mentioning her marriages, her childhood, her parents, her son. She lived entirely in the present, a narrowing space bounded by the walls of the townhouse and the hours between waking and sleeping. The world beyond ceased to exist for her because she had ceased to exist for it. Mrs. Shaw continued her work, maintaining Barbara's routines, documenting her decline, waiting for something to change. Nothing changed. The days continued, identical and empty, each one passing without event or consequence. Barbara sat in her chair, looked out at the garden, and waited for nothing in particular. In 1991, Barbara hired an interior designer named Marcus Pellier to redecorate the townhouse. The decision came suddenly, announced to Mrs. Shaw one morning without prior discussion. Barbara said the house felt oppressive, that she needed the space to feel different, that she could not continue living surrounded by things chosen by people she had never met. Pellier arrived the following week with fabric samples and catalogs. He was in his early 50s, expensively dressed, speaking with an accent Barbara could not place. He walked through the townhouse taking notes, commenting on the architecture and the bones of the space. He told Barbara the house had good proportions, but suffered from outdated furnishings and a lack of cohesive vision. Everything would need to be replaced. The project consumed 6 months. Furniture was removed and sold at auction. Walls were repainted in colors Pellier selected, grays and creams that he said would create serenity. New pieces arrived weekly, sofas Barbara would never sit on, dining tables that would never host meals, artwork chosen for its aesthetic compatibility rather than its content. Pellier supervised the installation of each item, adjusting placements by inches, ensuring everything aligned with his vision. Barbara approved each decision without meaningful input. When Pellier asked about her preferences, she told him to choose whatever he thought best. He seemed pleased by her deference, interpreting it as trust rather than apathy. The redesign cost over $300,000. Barbara signed the checks without reviewing the itemized invoices. When the work was completed, Pellier hosted a small unveiling, inviting Barbara to tour the transformed space. She walked through rooms that looked nothing like what she remembered, touching furniture that felt foreign, standing in a house that belonged to someone else. Pellier asked if she was pleased. Barbara said it was beautiful. He left satisfied, his portfolio enhanced by another high-profile project. Barbara spent 1 week living with the new design before asking Mrs. Shaw to move everything out of the sitting room, except the chair by the window. The chair had been the only piece Pellier had not replaced, deeming it too damaged and outdated to salvage. Barbara wanted to keep only that. Mrs. Shaw arranged for the new furniture to be moved to other floors. The sitting room returned to its previous emptiness, the expensive sofa and custom tables relocated to rooms Barbara never entered. In 1992, Barbara decided she wanted to learn Italian. She had studied French and German as a child, had lived in Europe for years, but had never mastered Italian, despite spending time in Rome and Venice. She hired a tutor, a young woman named Giulia Rossini, who came to the townhouse 3 times per week. The lessons were conducted in the library, Barbara and Giulia sitting at opposite ends of a long table. Giulia was patient and methodical, starting with basic vocabulary and simple grammar. Barbara struggled with pronunciation, with verb conjugations, with retaining what she had learned between sessions. Giulia adjusted her teaching approach repeatedly, simplifying lessons, focusing on conversational phrases rather than grammatical structures. After 3 months, Barbara had learned enough to order food in a restaurant and ask for directions. Giulia suggested they practice by visiting Italian neighborhoods in the city, by speaking with native speakers in real contexts. Barbara declined. The lessons continued in the library, divorced from any practical application. Barbara would never use the Italian she was learning because she would never go anywhere that required it. By the 6th month, Barbara had stopped preparing between lessons. Giulia would arrive to find that Barbara had not completed the exercises, had not reviewed the previous week's material, had not practiced the phrases they had discussed. The lessons became repetitive, covering the same ground session after session. Giulia's patience began to show strain. She suggested they might take a break, revisit the lessons when Barbara felt more motivated. Barbara agreed immediately. Giulia did not return. In 1993, Barbara commissioned a genealogist to research her family history. She wanted to know about the Woolworths before Frank, about the generations that had preceded the fortune, about where they had come from, and what they had done. The genealogist, a retired academic named Dr. Harrison Wells, accepted the commission enthusiastically. He worked for 8 months, traveling to archives in England and Ireland, examining birth records and immigration documents, tracing the family back through centuries of farmers and tradesmen. He compiled his findings in a leather-bound volume, over 200 pages detailing the Woolworth lineage from the 1600s to the present. The research was thorough and professionally presented, complete with family trees and annotated timelines. Dr. Wells delivered the volume personally, spending an hour presenting his findings to Barbara. He explained the family's origins in rural England, their migration to America in the 18th century, their struggles with poverty and illness before Frank Woolworth's retail innovations changed everything. He spoke with evident pride in his work, in the connections he had uncovered, in the narrative he had constructed. Barbara thanked him and accepted the volume. Dr. Wells asked if she had any questions, if there were areas she wanted him to explore further. Barbara said no. Everything seemed very complete. He left pleased with her apparent satisfaction. The volume remained on the library table for 2 weeks before Mrs. Shaw shelved it with other books Barbara had requested and never read. In 1994, Barbara began donating to charitable organizations. The impulse came without clear origin. She simply started writing checks to organizations whose solicitation letters had accumulated in the irrelevant pile. Cancer research, children's hospitals, arts foundations, animal welfare groups. She gave to all of them, amounts ranging from $5,000 to $50,000, responding to every request that reached her. The donations generated thank you letters and invitations to fundraising events. Organizations asked her to join boards, to lend her name to campaigns, to attend galas where major donors were recognized. Barbara declined everything. She wanted only to give money, not to participate in the machinery that distributed it. The checks continued, automatic responses to letters she barely read, money leaving accounts that would never be depleted regardless of her generosity. Her attorneys noticed the pattern and expressed concern. The donations were not tax strategic, not coordinated with estate planning, not structured to maximize benefit or minimize liability. Barbara told them the observations were noted and irrelevant. She continued giving to whatever organizations asked, her philanthropy as indiscriminate as it was substantial. In 1995, Barbara decided to write her memoirs. She announced this to Mrs. Shaw one morning, saying she wanted to document her life while she still remembered it. Mrs. Shaw set up a desk in the library with fresh notebooks and pens. Barbara began writing that afternoon. The project lasted 2 weeks. Barbara filled 30 pages with fragments. Childhood memories that contradicted each other, descriptions of people whose names she could not recall, events she could not date or place in sequence. The prose was disjointed, sentences beginning one thought and ending with another. She wrote about her mother's death, her grandfather's funeral, her first marriage, but the accounts were skeletal, missing the connective tissue that would make them coherent. She read what she had written and recognized its inadequacy. The memories were there but inaccessible, buried beneath decades of distance and deliberate forgetting. She could not reconstruct her life because she had spent so much effort trying to escape it. The notebooks were closed and placed in a desk drawer. She did not mention the memoir project again. In 1996, Barbara hired a personal trainer. Her physicians had recommended exercise to address her deteriorating health, to strengthen her bones, and improve her balance. The trainer, a woman named Michelle Kwan, came to the townhouse 3 times per week with exercise equipment and rehabilitation protocols. The sessions were difficult. Barbara could barely stand for more than a few minutes without support. Simple movements, raising her arms, bending her knees, turning her head, required concentration and caused pain. Michelle was encouraging but realistic, adjusting expectations constantly as Barbara's limitations became apparent. They worked on basic mobility, on preventing further decline rather than achieving improvement. After 2 months, Barbara stopped attending the sessions. Michelle would arrive to find Barbara still in bed or sitting in her chair, unwilling to move. Michelle tried various approaches, reducing session length, simplifying exercises, offering incentives. Nothing worked. Barbara had decided the effort was not worthwhile. Michelle suggested they pause until Barbara felt ready to resume. They never resumed. Each project began with intention and ended in abandonment. The language lessons, the genealogy, the memoir, the exercise program, all were attempts at transformation that failed before they could produce results. Barbara kept trying, kept initiating new endeavors, kept hoping that the next thing would be different. Nothing was different. Each failure confirmed what she already knew but could not accept. That change required sustained effort she no longer possessed. That reinvention was possible only for people who believed they had a future worth shaping. She stopped starting new projects in 1997. The interior remained unchanged. The language books remained unread. The exercise equipment remained in storage. She returned to her chair by the window and stopped pretending that anything would improve. The loneliness that had driven her constant attempts at reinvention settled into something permanent and familiar. She had been running from it for decades. Now she stopped running and let it catch her. Barbara had 4 children. She remembered this fact in the abstract, the way one might remember a historical date or a piece of trivia. Lance was the first, the only one from her first marriage, the one who had rejected her most completely. The others came from later marriages, their names and faces blurring together in her memory until Mrs. Shaw reminded her of the details. There was Grant, born during her 3rd marriage, now living somewhere in Europe. There was David from her 5th marriage, who had died young. She could not remember the circumstances. And there was the youngest, whose name she sometimes forgot until she saw it written on documents her attorneys brought for her to sign. In 1998, Mrs. Shaw mentioned that the youngest son had called. Barbara looked at her blankly. Mrs. Shaw clarified, "Anderson, your son with Mr. Vanderbilt." Barbara nodded slowly, the name triggering partial recognition. She had not spoken to him in years, could not remember the last time they had been in the same room. Mrs. Shaw asked if she wanted to return the call. Barbara said no. Anderson called again a week later. This time, Mrs. Shaw insisted, bringing the telephone to Barbara's chair and placing it in her hand before Barbara could refuse. Barbara held the receiver and said hello. Anderson's voice came through, polite and distant, asking how she was feeling. Barbara said she was fine. Anderson asked if he could visit. Barbara said that would be nice. They arranged a date. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. Anderson arrived on a Thursday afternoon in October. Mrs. Shaw answered the door and showed him to the sitting room, where Barbara waited in her chair. He was in his early 30s, well-dressed, composed in a way that suggested careful preparation. He kissed Barbara's cheek and sat on the sofa Pellier had selected. Barbara studied his face, searching for features she recognized as her own or his father's. She found few. They spoke carefully, circling topics without landing on them. Anderson asked about her health. Barbara said the doctors were managing everything adequately. Anderson mentioned his work, something in journalism, television news, perhaps. Barbara was not certain. He spoke about deadlines and assignments and travel. Barbara nodded at appropriate moments without absorbing the specifics. The conversation exhausted itself quickly. Anderson had come prepared with topics, but Barbara's responses were too brief to sustain discussion. When silence settled between them, he asked if there was anything she needed, anything he could help with. Barbara said no, everything was being handled. Anderson nodded and checked his watch. He had been there 35 minutes. He stood to leave. Barbara remained in her chair, not offering to see him out. Anderson leaned down to kiss her cheek again, his lips barely touching her skin. He told her he would call soon, that they should do this more often. Barbara agreed without conviction. Mrs. Shaw appeared to escort him to the door. Barbara heard their voices in the hallway, heard Anderson thanking Mrs. Shaw for taking care of his mother, heard the front door close. Barbara sat in her chair and tried to remember what Anderson had looked like as a child. She could not. She remembered the pregnancies in general terms, the nausea, the hospital rooms, the relief when they ended, but the babies themselves had been handled by nurses, raised by nannies, sent to boarding schools as soon as they were old enough. She had not raised any of them, not really. She had provided money and signed enrollment forms and attended occasional school events where she sat in the back and left early. Anderson did not call soon. Months passed. Barbara did not notice. In early 1999, she saw him on television. Mrs. Shaw had turned on the news while preparing Barbara's dinner. And there he was, standing in front of a government building, speaking into a microphone about something political. Barbara watched for a moment before asking Mrs. Shaw to change the channel. She did not want to see her son this way, as a stranger performing a job she did not understand. In the summer of 1999, Anderson called again. The conversation was shorter this time, more perfunctory. He asked how she was. She gave her standard answer. He mentioned he would be traveling for work, would be out of the country for several weeks. Barbara said she hoped his trip went well. They ended the call without arranging another visit. The distance between them was not hostile. It was simply complete. They were related by biology and legal documents, but nothing else connected them. Anderson had built a life that did not include her, had become someone she would not recognize if she passed him on the street. She had missed whatever years might have created a bond, had been absent during whatever moments might have mattered. In 2000, Barbara's attorneys informed her that Anderson was handling some of her estate planning matters. She had not known this, had not authorized it specifically, but apparently documents had been signed years earlier, granting him certain powers. The attorneys asked if she wanted to review these arrangements. Barbara said no. She trusted that everything was in order. She understood what this meant. Anderson was preparing for her death, organizing affairs so that the transition would be smooth when it came. This was practical and appropriate. Barbara felt no resentment about it. If anything, she felt relieved that someone was managing these details, that she would not have to think about them herself. In 2001, Anderson visited again. This time he brought someone with him, a man he introduced as his friend. The man's name was Ben, and he worked in the same field as Anderson, though Barbara didn't catch the details. They sat together on the sofa, close but not touching, speaking with an ease that suggested long familiarity. Barbara understood immediately what was being communicated without being stated directly. She looked at Anderson and then at Ben and said she was pleased to meet him. Anderson's shoulders relaxed slightly. The visit proceeded more comfortably than the last one had. Ben asked questions about the house, about the neighborhood, about New York in earlier decades. Barbara answered as best she could, grateful for someone who could sustain conversation where Anderson could not. When they left, Anderson seemed lighter, as though he had passed a test he had not been certain he would pass. Barbara sat in her chair after they departed and thought about what she had just witnessed. Her son had brought home someone important to him, seeking approval or at least acknowledgement. She had given it, though she suspected her approval meant little to him, given everything else that had been absent. The visits continued irregularly over the following years. Anderson came alone sometimes, with Ben other times, occasionally not at all for months. Barbara noticed that he never stayed long, never seemed entirely comfortable in the townhouse, never suggested that she visit wherever he lived. The relationship existed in these brief, controlled encounters, maintained out of obligation rather than desire. In 2003, Anderson called to inform her that he was getting more prominent assignments at work, that his career was advancing, that he might be less available for visits in the coming months. Barbara told him she understood, that his work was important, that he should not worry about her. He sounded relieved. They ended the call with promises to stay in touch that both knew would not be kept with any regularity. Barbara did not resent Anderson's distance. She had created it, had established the pattern decades earlier, when she had chosen hotels over nurseries, trips to Europe over school plays, alcohol over presents. Her children had learned early that they could not rely on her, that nurses and teachers in boarding schools would raise them, that their mother was a figure who appeared occasionally, but never stayed. Anderson had simply accepted what she had taught him. He maintained contact sufficient to fulfill minimal filial duty, but invested nothing beyond that. He had his own life, his own career, his own relationships. She was not part of any of it, and he had made peace with her absence in a way she never had. Mrs. Shaw mentioned once that Anderson was doing well, that she had seen him on television, that he seemed to be becoming quite successful. Barbara said that was nice. Mrs. Shaw seemed to expect more, pride perhaps, or interest in the details. Barbara offered neither. She was glad Anderson had built a life, but she could not claim any credit for it, could not feel maternal pride for a success she had not contributed to. In 2004, Anderson called on her birthday. He was the only one who remembered, or at least the only one who called. They spoke for 5 minutes. He asked how she was celebrating. Barbara said she was not celebrating, that birthdays at her age were simply markers of time passing. Anderson said he hoped she had a good day anyway. Barbara thanked him. They ended the call. She sat in her chair after hanging up and calculated how old she was. 92. She had lived longer than she had expected, longer than she had wanted. The years had accumulated without purpose, each one passing into the next, with nothing to distinguish them. Anderson had called because that was what children did on their parents' birthdays, a ritual performed out of habit rather than affection. Barbara understood that when she died, Anderson would handle the arrangements efficiently. He would attend the funeral, would speak to her attorneys, would ensure everything was managed properly. He would fulfill his obligations as her son, because that was how he had been raised, to do what was required, nothing more. She had taught him that through her absence, and he had learned the lesson perfectly. In 2005, Barbara's attorneys presented her with a portfolio of her real estate holdings. She owned properties she had forgotten about: a villa in Tangier, a house in Palm Beach, an apartment in Paris, the townhouse in New York, and several smaller properties purchased over the years for reasons she could no longer recall. The attorneys suggested consolidating, selling what she did not use, simplifying the estate for future management. Barbara looked through the documents without recognition. The photographs showed houses she had lived in briefly or not at all, rooms she could not picture herself occupying. The Tangier villa had been purchased in 1961, during her marriage to the Baron. She had stayed there one summer and never returned. The house had been maintained ever since, staff employed year-round to care for a property the owner never visited. The Palm Beach house had belonged to her father originally, transferred to her after his death, though she had never wanted it. She had visited once to inspect the property, spent 3 days walking through rooms filled with furniture he had selected, and left without changing anything. The house remained exactly as he had left it, a museum to a man she had barely known. The Paris apartment was the one she had lived in during the 1960s, the place where she had painted and written and attempted to build a life separate from her name. The attorneys informed her that the lease had been maintained continuously for over 40 years, the rent paid automatically from her accounts. Barbara had not been inside since 1978. She asked if her paintings were still there. The attorneys said the apartment had been cleared years ago, its contents disposed of when it was assumed she would not return. Barbara instructed them to sell everything except the New York townhouse. The attorneys began the process immediately, listing properties and coordinating sales. The Tangier villa sold within months to a European businessman. The Palm Beach house took longer, finally purchased by a developer who planned to demolish it and build something modern. The Paris apartment's lease was terminated, the space rented to someone else within weeks. The sales generated millions of dollars that were deposited into accounts Barbara never accessed. The attorneys invested the proceeds, diversified her portfolio, protected her assets. Barbara signed the papers they brought her and thought nothing more about the houses she had owned and abandoned. But the New York townhouse remained, and it was too large for one person who occupied only a single room. Barbara recognized this, but could not imagine living anywhere else. Moving required energy she did not possess, decisions she could not make, changes she could not tolerate. She stayed in her chair by the window, and the rest of the house stood empty around her. Mrs. Shaw suggested closing off the unused floors to reduce heating and maintenance costs. Barbara agreed. The third, fourth, and fifth floors were sealed, their doors locked, their utilities disconnected. The furniture Pellier had selected remained in those rooms, aging slowly in darkness and stillness. Dust accumulated on surfaces no one would ever touch again. Even the second floor, where Barbara lived, had become too much. She used only the bedroom and sitting room. The hallway connecting them stretched longer each year, her walk from bed to chair requiring more effort, more time, more rest stops along the way. Mrs. Shaw installed a chair halfway down the hall where Barbara could sit when the distance became too great to manage in one attempt. The first floor, the entrance hall, the formal living room, the dining room, the library, remained furnished and maintained but unused. Mrs. Shaw dusted weekly, the housekeeper cleaned monthly, but no one lived there. The dining table seated 12 and had not hosted a meal in over a decade. The living room sofas had never been sat on. The library's books remained on their shelves unread and gradually yellowing. Barbara sometimes stood at the top of the stairs and looked down at the first floor, at the chandelier in the entrance hall, at the marble floor she had crossed countless times. The distance to the ground floor felt impossible now, the stairs too steep, her body too fragile. She had not descended to the first floor in over a year. She would never go down there again. In 2006, Mrs. Shaw suggested hiring additional staff to help with Barbara's care. Barbara's mobility had declined further, and Mrs. Shaw could no longer manage alone. Barbara agreed, and 2 nurses' aides were hired, rotating shifts to ensure someone was always available. They were quiet, efficient women who spoke little and moved through the house like ghosts. The expanded staff made the emptiness of the house more apparent. 4 people now lived and worked in a space designed for 20. Their footsteps echoed in the halls. Their voices carried through empty rooms. The house had been built for entertaining, for hosting parties and accommodating guests, for displaying wealth through conspicuous space. Now it held one dying woman and the people paid to keep her alive. Barbara began spending nights in the sitting room chair, unable or unwilling to make the walk to the bedroom. Mrs. Shaw set up a cot nearby, a narrow bed with hospital rails where Barbara could sleep when exhaustion overtook her. The bedroom remained prepared, its bed made daily by the housekeeper, but Barbara stopped using it. She lived entirely in the sitting room now, the space contracting further. The view from the window became her entire world. She watched the garden through seasons, through years, through the slow progression of light across brick walls. In spring, weeds grew thick among the shrubs. In summer, heat settled over everything, the grass turning brown. In fall, leaves blew in from neighboring properties and collected in corners. In winter, snow covered the neglect, making everything clean and blank. She sometimes saw the woman in the dark dress, though less frequently now. The hallucinations had become routine enough that Barbara no longer mentioned them. She watched the figure move along the wall, searching for something or simply pacing, and felt a kinship she could not explain. They were both trapped in this garden, both circling the same small space, both waiting for nothing. In 2007, Barbara asked Mrs. Shaw how much the townhouse cost to maintain. Mrs. Shaw consulted with the attorneys and returned with figures. Property taxes, utilities, staff salaries, repairs, maintenance. The annual cost exceeded $400,000. Barbara absorbed this information without reaction. She asked what would happen to the house after she died. Mrs. Shaw said she did not know, that such matters would be determined by her will and her estate plan. Barbara asked if Mrs. Shaw thought anyone would want to live here. Mrs. Shaw paused before answering honestly. Probably not as it currently stood. The house would likely be sold, possibly torn down, the property redeveloped into something modern. Barbara nodded. She had filled this house with furniture no one sat on, decorated it with art no one looked at, maintained it with money that accomplished nothing except preserving emptiness. After her death, it would be dismantled and erased, another property transaction in a city where nothing remained unchanged for long. She thought about all the houses she had owned, all the rooms she had occupied briefly before moving on. Hotel suites and rented villas and inherited estates, each one abandoned when it failed to provide whatever she had been seeking. She had never stayed anywhere long enough to make it a home, had never accumulated the small domestic intimacies that transform space into belonging. The townhouse was the longest she had remained in one place since childhood, but even here she had contracted steadily inward, surrendering rooms until only one remained. She lived now in a space barely larger than a hotel suite, surrounded by a house too big to use and too expensive to justify. Mrs. Shaw asked if Barbara wanted to consider moving somewhere smaller, more manageable, designed for someone with her needs. There were residences for elderly people, comfortable places with medical staff and assistants. Barbara said no, she would stay here. Mrs. Shaw did not suggest it again. The house stood around her, mostly dark, mostly silent, its rooms holding nothing but the furniture and the dust, and the weight of money that had purchased space but could not fill it. Barbara sat in her chair and looked out at the garden and understood that she would die here, in this room, surrounded by emptiness she had spent millions to maintain. In 2008, Barbara fell again. This time she did not get up. Mrs. Shaw found her on the floor of the sitting room, conscious but unable to move. An ambulance was called despite Barbara's weak protests. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed a fractured hip and severe dehydration. Surgery was required. Barbara was 89 years old, her bones brittle, her body offering little reserve for recovery. The surgery was successful in technical terms. The hip was repaired, the fracture stabilized. But Barbara never walked again. Weeks of physical therapy produced no improvement. Her body had reached a limit it would not cross. She was discharged to a rehabilitation facility, then to a nursing arrangement at the townhouse that required round-the-clock medical supervision. The sitting room was converted into a hospital room. A medical bed was installed, monitors and equipment arranged within reach. Medications organized in a locked cabinet Mrs. Shaw controlled. 2 nurses now staffed the house continuously, overlapping shifts ensuring Barbara was never alone. The chair by the window remained, but Barbara could no longer sit in it. She spent her days in bed, propped at angles that prevented bed sores, turned regularly by nurses whose names she could not remember. In 2009, Barbara's attorneys recommended relocating her to a facility better equipped for her needs. The townhouse, despite the modifications, was not designed for end-stage care. There were residences that specialized in this, comfortable places where she would have access to better medical resources. Barbara refused. She had said she would die in this house, and she meant it. The cost of maintaining her care exceeded $1 million per year. The attorneys documented the expenses and paid them without comment. Barbara's fortune could sustain this indefinitely. Money, which had solved nothing else in her life, could at least purchase the right to die where she chose. Her mind deteriorated alongside her body. Some days she was lucid, able to recognize Mrs. Shaw and respond to questions appropriately. Other days she believed she was 20 years old, asking for her grandfather, wondering when her debut party would begin. She spoke to people who were not there, carried on conversations with husbands long dead, asked nurses to deliver messages to her mother. Mrs. Shaw documented these episodes in her notebook, which had grown into multiple volumes over the years. The notes traced Barbara's decline in careful detail: weight loss, medication changes, cognitive lapses, moments of clarity. The notebooks would eventually be turned over to Barbara's estate, reviewed by attorneys, and sealed from public access. In 2010, Anderson visited. He had not been to the townhouse in over a year, his career having taken him to various international assignments. He climbed the stairs to the second floor and entered the converted sitting room, stopping in the doorway when he saw the medical equipment, the hospital bed, the frail figure barely visible beneath white sheets. Mrs. Shaw greeted him and explained Barbara's condition. Anderson nodded, absorbing the information with professional composure. He approached the bed. Barbara's eyes were open but unfocused. Mrs. Shaw said gently that Anderson was here, that her son had come to visit. Barbara's eyes moved toward him, recognition flickering across her face for a moment before fading. Anderson sat in a chair beside the bed. He did not know what to say. He told Barbara he had been working, that he had traveled to several countries recently, that his career was going well. Barbara gave no indication she heard or understood. Anderson continued speaking anyway, filling silence with information she could not process. After 20 minutes, he stood to leave. He told Mrs. Shaw to call if Barbara's condition changed significantly, if there was anything he needed to know. Mrs. Shaw said she would. Anderson looked back at the bed one more time, at the woman who had given birth to him, but had never really been his mother, and left. In 2011, Barbara stopped eating. The nurses tried various approaches, different foods, liquid supplements, feeding schedules adjusted to her apparent preferences. Nothing worked. Barbara turned her head away when food was offered, kept her mouth closed, refused to swallow. Her weight dropped below 70 pounds. The nurses consulted with physicians. A feeding tube was discussed. Mrs. Shaw asked what Barbara would want. The nurses had no answer. Medical intervention could prolong her life, but to what purpose? Barbara had not expressed wishes about end-of-life care, had signed no advance directives, had never discussed what measures she wanted taken or avoided. Mrs. Shaw made the decision. No feeding tube. If Barbara had stopped eating, they would respect that choice. The nurses would continue offering food and water, but they would not force it. Barbara's body was shutting down, beginning the process it had been approaching for years. They would allow it to proceed. Barbara lingered for months in this state, sustained by minimal water intake and whatever nutrients could be absorbed from the small amounts she occasionally accepted. She slept most of the day, waking only briefly before drifting back into unconsciousness. The periods of lucidity ended completely. She existed in a twilight state, neither fully present nor fully absent. In May 2011, Barbara developed pneumonia. The infection settled in her lungs, her weakened immune system offering no resistance. Antibiotics were administered, but had minimal effect. Her breathing became labored, her chest rattling with fluid. The nurses increased her oxygen and made her as comfortable as possible. Mrs. Shaw called Anderson. She explained that the end was approaching, that it could be days or hours, that he should come if he wanted to see his mother before she died. Anderson said he would try to get there, that he was out of the country, but would catch the next available flight. He did not arrive in time. The estate was settled over 18 months. Attorneys cataloged assets, paid outstanding debts, filed tax documents, and began the process of distributing Barbara's fortune to the charitable organizations named in her will. The amount was substantial. Over $60 million after taxes and expenses accumulated from a lifetime of careful management by people she had never met. The foundations that received the money issued press releases thanking the estate of Barbara Hutton for her generosity. They announced scholarships in her name, research grants bearing the Woolworth Hutton designation, arts programs that would carry her legacy forward. None of these organizations had known Barbara personally. Most had received her donations during her lifetime without ever meeting her, accepting checks signed by attorneys and sending form letters of gratitude she had never read. The press coverage of her death was minimal. Obituaries appeared in major newspapers focusing on her marriages, her inheritance, and the poor little rich girl, nickname that had followed her since 1933. The articles recounted her 7 husbands, her extravagant lifestyle, her isolation in later years. They mentioned her son Anderson Cooper, now a prominent journalist, but offered few details about their relationship. Some obituaries attempted to find meaning in her life, to extract lessons or commentary about wealth and happiness. They suggested that her story demonstrated the emptiness of material comfort, the isolation that accompanied extreme privilege, the tragedy of a woman who had everything except what mattered. These interpretations were not wrong, but they simplified something more complex into morality tales that satisfied readers looking for clear conclusions. What the obituaries did not mention was the paintings. Over 300 canvases had been created between 1961 and 1967, stored in Paris, abandoned when storage fees went unpaid, and eventually destroyed by a facility following standard procedures for delinquent accounts. The work had been disposed of years before Barbara's death, incinerated or discarded as unclaimed property. No photographs existed. No one had documented what she had made during those 6 years when painting had been the only thing that mattered to her. The stories she had written under pseudonyms were equally lost. The small literary magazines that had published her work in the 1960s had ceased publication decades earlier. Libraries had not archived them. Digital records did not exist. The fiction she had labored over, revised carefully, and submitted under false names had disappeared completely. Nothing she had created under her own power, without her name or money attached, had survived. What remained was the wealth and the name and the mythology. The Barbara Hutton fashion line, defunct since 1985, was occasionally referenced in articles about vintage clothing or 20th century retail history. The houses she had owned appeared in architectural records and real estate listings. Her marriages were footnoted in biographies of her husbands. Cary Grant's life story mentioned her briefly. Porfirio Rubirosa's legend included her among his conquests. Lance, her first son, had died in 1972 from a heart attack while hiking in Hawaii. He was 36 years old. Barbara had learned of his death through her attorneys who had received notification from his estate. She had not been informed of a funeral, had not been listed among his survivors in the death notice. His will had explicitly stated that no portion of his estate should pass to his mother under any circumstances. He had rejected her even in death, ensuring the separation continued beyond life. Anderson remained the only living connection to Barbara, and he spoke about her rarely. In interviews over the years, he mentioned her in passing when asked about his childhood, describing a distant mother, boarding schools, limited contact. He did not elaborate or offer anecdotes. When pressed for details, he changed the subject. His reluctance was not protective or affectionate. It was simply an acknowledgement that there was little to say about a relationship that had barely existed. In 2013, 2 years after Barbara's death, a graduate student researching American heiresses contacted Anderson's office requesting an interview about his mother. The request was declined through a publicist. Similar requests came periodically. Journalists writing about the Woolworth family, historians researching women and wealth in the 20th century, documentary filmmakers proposing projects about forgotten socialites. All were declined. The Woolworth mansion on Fifth Avenue where Barbara had been born was demolished in 1925, shortly after her grandfather's death. The site was redeveloped into commercial property, then residential apartments, then renovated again into luxury condominiums. No plaque marked that Barbara Hutton had been born there. The building's history began with its current incarnation, the past erased through successive demolitions and constructions. The townhouse on East 78th Street, where Barbara had died, was transformed by its new owners exactly as planned. Walls were removed, rooms reconfigured, the space opened and modernized. The sitting room where she had spent her final years became part of a larger living area, its windows enlarged, its association with death eliminated through renovation. The family who lived there knew the house's previous owner only as a historical footnote, a name mentioned when they researched the property before purchasing it. Mrs. Eleanor Shaw retired after Barbara's death. She moved to Florida, where she lived quietly until her own death in 2018. Her notebooks remained sealed in estate storage, accessible only through court order and never requested. The detailed record she had maintained of Barbara's final decades existed, but was not read, its documentation of decline and isolation preserved but unexamined. The charitable foundations continued their work, distributing grants and scholarships funded by Barbara's estate. Students received financial aid bearing the Woolworth Hutton name without knowing who Barbara had been or why her money was now supporting their education. Medical researchers pursued projects funded by her estate without connecting the name on their grant applications to the woman who had died alone in a New York townhouse. In this way, Barbara's fortune accomplished in death what it had failed to accomplish in life. It provided benefit, created opportunity, generated gratitude. The money, managed by competent people following clear instructions, did measurable good. It was perhaps the most successful thing her wealth had ever achieved, possible only because she was no longer there to interfere with its distribution. Her name appeared occasionally in context that suggested she had been remembered. Retrospectives about 20th century society, articles about famous inheritances, lists of the wealthiest women in history. These mentions were brief and factual, noting her fortune, her marriages, her death. They conveyed information without understanding, preserved facts without insight. The truth was that Barbara had been forgotten almost immediately. The world that had made her famous in 1933 had disappeared decades before her death. The society that had judged her debut as obscene excess no longer existed. The magazines that had chronicled her marriages had ceased publication. The people who had known her personally had died or moved on, their memories of her fading until she became simply another name from a distant era. What she left behind was money that would be spent, property that would be sold, a name that would appear in reference books and genealogies without context or meaning. She left no children who wanted to remember her, no friends who mourned her absence, no work that bore her name and reflected her actual self. She had lived 93 years and accumulated one of the largest fortunes of her generation, and none of it had prevented her from disappearing completely. The grave at Woodlawn Cemetery remained unmarked except for the family name. Visitors to the Woolworth Mausoleum came to see the monument to Frank Woolworth, the retail pioneer, the man who had built an empire from 5 and dime stores. Barbara was there too, but no one came looking for her. Her presence in the vault was incidental, a detail that mattered only to attorneys settling her estate and genealogists documenting family trees. Somewhere in the sealed estate files were the documents that might have told her story more completely. Mrs. Shaw's notebooks, medical records, correspondence with attorneys, financial statements documenting every dollar she had spent over 7 decades. These materials existed in storage facilities, boxed and labeled, preserved but inaccessible. The full record of her life was available but unread, maintained as legal requirement rather than historical interest. And perhaps that was appropriate. Barbara had spent her life trying to escape being seen, trying to separate herself from her name and her money, trying to create something that belonged to her alone. The paintings and stories she had made in private were gone, destroyed, or lost. What remained was only the public record, the marriages, the money, the mythology. The real Barbara, whatever self had existed beneath the inheritance and the headlines, had succeeded in disappearing. She had wanted to be taken seriously as an artist and a writer. Instead, she was remembered as an heiress who had married badly. She had wanted connection with her children. Instead, she had funded their educations and been excluded from their lives. She had wanted to matter in ways that transcended her bank account. Instead, her most enduring contribution was charitable donations she had approved without interest or understanding. The fortune that had defined her entire existence outlasted her by decades, continuing to generate interest, fund programs, and accomplish goals through foundations that would operate long after everyone who had known Barbara personally was dead. The money proved more durable than the woman, more useful in absence than it had ever been in her possession. On the morning Barbara Hutton died, the nurse who recorded her time of death noted the weather in the margin of her log. Clear skies, unseasonably warm for May. It was the kind of detail that had no medical relevance but seemed worth preserving nonetheless. By afternoon, when the body was removed from the townhouse, the temperature had dropped. Mrs. Shaw stood at the second-floor window and watched the ambulance pull away, carrying Barbara toward whatever preparations preceded burial. The window overlooked the garden where Barbara had spent years watching a figure in a dark dress that existed only in her failing mind. The garden was overgrown now, the shrubs untrimmed for seasons, the grass patchy and brown. It would be cleared when the house sold, landscaped into something presentable for the next owners. Nothing of Barbara's time there would remain visible. In the weeks after her death, Anderson went through the motions required of him. He signed papers, made decisions about the service, authorized the estate liquidators. He did these things with the efficiency of someone managing a professional obligation rather than mourning a parent. People who knew him professionally expressed condolences. He thanked them and moved on. His grief, if it existed, was not for the woman who had died, but for the mother he had never had. The question of what Barbara's life meant remained unanswered because it had never been clearly asked. The foundations distributing her money did not need to understand her to put her fortune to use. The students receiving scholarships in her name learned only that she had been wealthy and generous, a simplification that served its purpose. The people who had known her were too few and too disconnected to offer coherent testimony. She had been born into impossible circumstances, a motherless child, an absent father, a fortune that attracted everyone except those who might have loved her, without calculation. She had married 7 times, searching for something she could not name in men who saw her as opportunity rather than person. She had given birth to children she could not raise, hiring others to provide what she did not know how to give. She had created art and written stories that no one would see, her only authentic work destroyed by bureaucratic procedure and institutional indifference. The money that had shaped every aspect of her existence had purchased comfort, but not peace, companionship, but not intimacy, survival, but not purpose. It had allowed her to live 93 years without ever finding a reason that satisfied her. It had given her every material advantage and solved nothing that mattered. There were no lessons in her story, no moral clarity to extract from the wreckage. She was neither hero nor villain, neither victim nor agent of her own destruction. She was a woman who inherited a fortune at birth and spent a lifetime discovering what it could not buy, which was everything she actually wanted. The discovery did not make her noble or tragic in any redemptive sense. It simply made her a person who had lived and suffered and died without resolution. The houses she had owned were sold or demolished. The furniture was auctioned. The jewelry was dispersed. The clothes donated or discarded. The physical evidence of her life was dismantled with bureaucratic efficiency, converted into cash, and distributed according to legal documents she had signed during moments of clarity she could barely remember. What remained was harder to locate. It existed in Anderson's careful silence when asked about his childhood, in Mrs. Shaw's notebooks locked in storage, in the gap where paintings should have been if anyone had thought to preserve them. It existed in the absence, in relationships that never formed, in potential never realized, in a life that had all the materials for happiness except the knowledge of how to construct it. Barbara Hutton had been the poor little rich girl, the woman who proved that money could not buy love or purpose or meaning. The irony was too obvious to be interesting, the conclusion too expected to provoke thought. Yet beneath the tired morality tale was something more unsettling, the possibility that her wealth was not the problem, but simply the circumstance that made the problem visible. That loneliness and disconnection, and the inability to find purpose, were not exclusive to the rich, but only more apparent when money eliminated every other excuse. She died as she had lived, alone, uncomfortable, waiting for nothing in particular. The end came not as culmination or release, but as simple cessation, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated damage of decades. There was no deathbed wisdom, no final reconciliation, no moment of clarity that made the suffering worthwhile. She stopped breathing, and the nurses recorded the time, and the machinery of her estate began its work. The grave remained unmarked except for the family name. The fortune continued generating interest and funding programs. The name appeared occasionally in historical contexts that conveyed no understanding of the person it had belonged to. 70 years after her debut had made her famous, she had succeeded in becoming invisible again, erased not through deliberate forgetting, but through simple irrelevance. Somewhere in the sealed files was the full accounting. Every dollar spent, every property purchased, every marriage contracted and dissolved, every hospital admission, every medication prescribed. The numbers documented a life in financial terms, precise and comprehensive, and utterly inadequate. They told what Barbara had cost, but not what she had wanted. They preserved the transactions, but not the person. And perhaps that was the only honest ending. Not redemption or condemnation, not meaning discovered or lessons learned, but simply the acknowledgement that she had existed, had suffered in ways both visible and hidden, and had left behind a fortune that would outlast any memory of who she had been. The money proved more durable than love, more lasting than art, more successful than any human connection she had attempted. Barbara Hutton had everything except what she needed. The observation was true but insufficient, explaining nothing about why need and resource had remained so perfectly, persistently separate. She had died without answering that question, and no one who survived her could answer it either. The mystery remained, locked in sealed files and destroyed paintings, and the silence of people who had nothing left to say, nothing